The wind came down off the mountain before the train did. Jasmine Monroe felt it first through the gap between her coat collar and the window glass, a cold so particular and purposeful it seemed less like weather and more like a warning. She had been awake since Denver watching the world outside, narrow from broad plains to foothills, to the crowded snow-laden shoulders of the San Juan Range. And now as the locomotive labored into the small station at Harlan's Creek, Colorado territory, the world outside the window had gone entirely white. She gathered her things with the deliberate calm of a woman who had learned not to hurry. Two carpet bags, one satchel, and a small wooden case that held her mother's recipe journals, the journals she had packed last and would unpack first whatever came next. She stood in the aisle while the other passengers collected themselves around her, and she did not apologize for the space she occupied. Though she was aware of it, the way she was always aware of it, steadily, without drama. The way you are aware of your own heartbeat. The station at Harlan's Creek was not much of a station. A single-room building with a pot-bellied stove and four wooden benches and a ticket window that appeared to be unmanned. Outside on the platform, a boy of perhaps 14 stood with snow accumulating on the brim of his hat, watching the train with the expression of someone who had expected fewer passengers and was not entirely pleased with the count. Jasmine was the last one off. The cold hit her properly. Then not the teasing cold of the window gap, but the full concentrated cold of a mountain December, the kind that found the spaces between your fingers and reminded you that you were made of warm things in a cold world. She adjusted the handles of her carpet bags and stood on the platform while the other passengers, a traveling salesman, an older couple who moved with the coordinated efficiency of long practice, a young man who looked like he might be heading for the mines, dispersed toward a wagon that waited at the edge of the platform. No one was there for Jasmine. She had known intellectually that this was a possibility. The letter from Mr. Elijah Stone had been warm enough in its way businesslike, as all correspondence between mail-order brides and their intended husbands tended toward being, but with a quality of honesty in it that she had found more reassuring than flattery would have been. He had described the ranch plainly. He had described himself plainly. He had said he was a widower with a niece in his care and that he needed a capable woman who could manage a household in difficult conditions. He had not promised romance, which she had appreciated because she had not expected any. She was 26 years old and practical about her circumstances and what she was offering and what she was likely to receive in return. The letter agreeing to her arrival had come from his foreman, a man named Gerald Pruitt, because Mr. Stone had been out on the South Range and unable to right himself. At least that was what the letter said. She waited on the platform for 10 minutes. The snow continued to fall. The boy in the hat, who had apparently been waiting for the mail pouch and nothing else, tucked it under his arm and disappeared toward the wagon. Then a man came out of the station building and stood at the top of the steps and looked at her with an expression that she could not quite read, not unkind but careful, like a man who had been given news he hadn't expected and was working out how to deliver it. He was perhaps 50 broad through the shoulders with a jaw like weathered timber and a mustache that had seen better decades. He wore a canvas coat and good boots and a hat that he removed when he reached her, which she took as a reasonable sign. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Yes, I'm Gerald Pruitt. I work for Mr. Stone out at Coldwater Ranch." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'm afraid we've got a situation." She waited. She was good at waiting. Mr. Stone sent word. Pruitt said that the arrangement's been called off. The wind moved between them, carrying a gust of snow. "He's asking that we find you accommodations in town while the weather clears, and that the train company be contacted about getting you home on the first available." "When did he send this word?" Jasmine asked. Pruitt glanced at the hat in his hands. "Week ago, miss." "Then why did no one contact me? The wire office in Pueblo said they sent a telegram, but—" He stopped. "Miss Monroe, I'm sorry, I truly am. I don't know what went wrong with the telegraph, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Mr. Stone asked me to come down here and explain the situation and see you settled comfortable until travel's possible." Jasmine set down the heavier of her carpet bags because her arm was tired. She looked up at the mountains above the town, what she could see of them through the snow, which was not much, just shapes suggested by darker shades of white and gray, vast and unconcerned. She had sold most of her furniture to afford this journey. She had surrendered the lease on the small house in Cincinnati where she had lived with her mother for the last 4 years, nursing her through the slow decline that had finally ended in September. She had packed everything she valued into 2 carpet bags, a satchel, and a wooden case, and she had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of a letter from a man she had never met. "What are my options?" she said. Pruitt seemed surprised by the question, or perhaps by the evenness with which she asked it. Well, he said, there's the boarding house Mrs. Aldicott's on the main street. She's a decent woman, clean place, takes in travelers regular. That'd be my recommendation. And when might travel be possible? He looked at the sky, then back at her. Miss Monroe, that storm that's coming, and it is coming, make no mistake, that's liable to close the pass for 3 weeks, maybe 4. After December storms like this, the train doesn't run again till the weather breaks, and then there's a backlog of freight that goes first. He paused. I'm sorry to be plain about it. I prefer plain, she said. She picked up her carpet bag. If you could show me to the boarding house, she said, I would be grateful. Hatch. Mrs. Aldicott's boarding house was on the north side of the main street, a 2-story building with green shutters that had once been a brighter green, and a porch that wrapped around the front in the east side. The boards well kept and swept clear of the current snowfall, with the ongoing, slightly futile energy of a woman determined to maintain order in the face of weather. Mrs. Aldicott herself was perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned up under a house cap, and the kind of face that had once been pretty and had moved through pretty into something more durable. She looked at Jasmine with an assessment that was not unkind, the kind of look that took in the quality of a person's coat, the condition of their luggage, the straightness of their spine, and arrived apparently at a favorable enough conclusion. Pruitt, she said to the foreman, who had carried the heavier bag without being asked. Estelle. He set the bag down in the front hallway. Miss Monroe's been on the train 2 days from Cincinnati. She'll need a room through the winter storm and longer until the pass opens. Mrs. Aldicott looked at Jasmine again. That Elijah Stone's doing... Yes, ma'am, Pruitt said. Something moved across Mrs. Aldicott's face, irritation, or its first cousin. That man, she said in the tone of someone who had been saying that man for years and expected to keep saying it. She picked up one of the carpet bags herself. Come in then, Miss Monroe. Rooms on the 2nd floor south-facing. You'll have the best light there is, which isn't saying much this time of year, but it's something. Pruitt at the door cleared his throat. Mr. Stone said to tell you the ranch will cover. Tell Mr. Stone, Mrs. Aldicott said without turning around, that Miss Monroe is my guest and I'll sort the particulars when I'm ready. Shut the door on your way out, Gerald. The cold's getting in. Pruitt left. Mrs. Aldicott led Jasmine up the stairs. The room was small and clean, with a rope bed and a good mattress, and 2 wool blankets and a quilt in the wedding ring pattern that Jasmine recognized as the kind of work that takes months. There was a washstand and a small mirror, and a window that looked south toward what would have been a view of the mountains in clear weather. Today there was only white. Washrooms at the end of the hall, Mrs. Aldicott said. Supper's at 6, breakfast at 7. I don't serve dinner midday in winter, too much work, but there's bread and cold meat in the kitchen if you're hungry between. The stove's in the parlor and I keep it going all day. She set the bag down at the foot of the bed. You have everything you need. Yes, thank you. Mrs. Aldicott hesitated at the door. You're not going to cry, are you? Jasmine looked at her. No. Good. The older woman nodded something like approval in the line of her mouth. Crying doesn't help, and it wets your face. And in weather like this, a wet face is the last thing you want. Come down when you're settled. I'll put the kettle on. She left, and Jasmine sat down on the edge of the bed, and she was alone in a town she had not heard of 6 months ago, in a room she had not planned on, in a life that had once again arranged itself without her permission. She sat for a moment. She breathed. Then she unpacked her mother's recipe journals and set them on the washstand, and she took out her good wool dress for supper and hung it to air, and she poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her hands and face. The water was cold. She washed carefully and thoroughly the way her mother had taught her, because her mother had believed that you could face almost anything if you started from a clean face. When she went downstairs, the kettle was on, and Mrs. Aldicott had set out 2 cups. The storm settled in that night. Jasmine lay awake and listened to it work, the particular sound of wind through mountain timber, which was nothing like city wind or plains. Wind which had a voice that rose and fell like argument, and the accompanying percussion of snow against the window glass, dry and steady. She was warm enough under Mrs. Aldicott's blankets. Her body was tired from 2 days on a train, and her mind was busy with the kind of accounting that had no ledger, what she had left behind, what she had arrived into, what came next. But she did not lie awake in the grip of that accounting for very long. She was a practical woman. Lying awake did not change her situation, and morning would want her rested, and so she closed her eyes and she slept. In the morning she came downstairs before Mrs. Aldicott had finished cooking and asked simply if she could help. Mrs. Aldicott gave her a look. You know what you're doing in a kitchen. I do. Then take those biscuits before they burn, Mrs. Aldicott said, and we'll see. The biscuits did not burn. Jasmine pulled them from the oven with the certain knowledge of someone who has lived by a kitchen clock rather than a wall clock, who knows a biscuit by its smell before she knows it by her eyes. She set them on the cooling rack and moved to the eggs, which were just coming to the right temperature, and managed the toast without being asked. Mrs. Aldicott watched her with an expression that shifted over the next 15 minutes from assessment to something that might eventually become respect. 3 other boarders came down to breakfast, a mine surveyor named Holloway, who was waiting out the weather with studied patience, and the older couple from the train, the Pemberton Wests, who had apparently been traveling to see a daughter in Alamosa and were now marooned with philosophical good humor. They ate the biscuits with the enthusiasm of people who recognize good work, and Holloway had 3 and asked if there might be more. After breakfast, while Mrs. Aldicott washed up, Jasmine put on her coat and her good boots and went out. The storm had not stopped. The main street of Harlan's Creek lay under a foot of new snow, and flakes were still falling with the purposeful density of a curtain being drawn, and the cold was profound. But she had not come 2,000 miles to sit in a boarding house room and wait. She had not, she thought with a quality of clear-eyed honesty she had learned from her mother, come 2,000 miles to be an inconvenience in someone else's story. She wanted to understand where she was. Harlan's Creek, as it presented itself on this particular December morning, under 3 feet of accumulated snow, was a town of perhaps 300 souls and approximately 40 buildings strung along a main street that ran east-west between the mountain foothills to the north and a frozen creek to the south that gave the town its name. There was a general store, Morrison's, with a faded sign, and a post office, and a dry goods shop, and a small building that was either a church or had recently been a church, judging by the bell that remained in its tower. There was a livery at the east end of the street. There was what appeared to be a saloon, though it was closed at this hour, its windows dark. What struck her walking through the snow was what was not there. Several buildings stood empty. She could tell by the windows, unfogged by interior warmth, dark in some cases, sporting the particular vacancy of places that had been abandoned rather than merely closed for winter. One had a for sale sign nailed to its door, the ink beginning to run from weather. Another had a broken shutter that no one had repaired. A third showed evidence of having once been a bakery. There were ghost outlines on the window glass where lettering had been painted and then removed and was now simply a shell. She counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty buildings on the main street alone, and those were only the ones she could see. A woman hurried past her on the boardwalk, head down against the snow, a basket over her arm. She glanced at Jasmine, the glance of someone clocking a stranger, and kept moving. From inside Morrison's general store came the smell of wood smoke and lamp oil, the sounds of low voices. Jasmine stood in the falling snow for a long moment, looking up and down the street. A dog crossed at the far end, moving with the energy-efficient gait of an animal that knew where it was going and wanted to get there. A wagon passed piled with supplies, the driver hunched inside his coat. Half the town, she thought, is already gone. She did not know yet why she knew this, or what it meant, or what, if anything, it had to do with her. She was a stranded woman in a strange town, waiting for weather, waiting for the next chapter of her life to arrange itself. She had no claim on Harlan's Creek, and it had no claim on her. She turned back toward the boarding house. She had promised Mrs. Aldicott she would help with the midday bread. On the 3rd day of her stranding, Gerald Pruitt came to the boarding house. He came in the late afternoon when the snow had paused, and the light that remained was the particular pale gold of a winter sun near the horizon. And he stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands and the manner of a man who had been sent to do something he was not entirely sure about. "Mr. Stone asks," he said, "if you might be willing to come out to the ranch." Jasmine, who had been mending a loose button on her second-best blouse, set down her needle. "I thought the arrangement was concluded." "It is." Pruitt turned his hat. "That is, he's not reopened it. That's not what this is. It's—" He stopped. Started again. "Abigail, his niece, she's 11. She's been sick since Thursday, started as a cold, but it's moved into her chest, and the doctor, well." He paused again with the particular delicacy of someone trying to be accurate without being alarming. "Doc Hennessy's not young, and his eyesight's not what it was, and he's better with horses than with children, if I'm honest. One of the women in town mentioned your name, said you'd helped her boy with a croup remedy you made." "Mrs. Toland's boy," Jasmine said. That had been 2 days ago. The boy had been perhaps 7, coughing badly in the general store, while his mother tried to manage a cart of supplies and the cough both. Jasmine had asked if she might help, and the woman had looked at her with the particular mixture of desperation and skepticism that mothers get when someone unexpected offers assistance, and had allowed it. The remedy was straightforward honey and ginger and slippery elm in hot water, with a compress for the chest things that Jasmine had been making since she was 16 when her mother's health began its long decline. "Yes," Pruitt said, "her. She spoke well of you." Jasmine set down her mending entirely and stood. "What are the child's symptoms?" He listed them: the cough, the fever, the difficulty breathing, the way the girl had been refusing food since yesterday. Jasmine listened and felt moving through her the particular kind of attention that she had developed over years of caring for her mother. Not panic, not alarm, but focus, the way a lantern's flame narrows when you turn the wick. "I'll need to go to Morrison's first," she said, "for a few things." "Of course." He was already moving toward the door. "Mr. Stone, he said he'd compensate you for—" "Let's not discuss that now," Jasmine said. "Let's get the child better first." The road to Coldwater Ranch was 4 miles north of town and climbed steadily into the mountain timber, and in the snow it was slow going, even with Pruitt's capable driving and a solid pair of horses who knew the route. Jasmine sat in the wagon bed wrapped in a borrowed wool blanket and watched the pines close in around them, their branches bowed under accumulated white, the world quieter than any world she had known. She was not afraid precisely of what she was riding toward. She had thought about Elijah Stone these past 3 days, with the measured curiosity she brought to most things, trying to understand rather than judge. A man who had lost his wife and infant son in a blizzard would not, she thought, be a simple man to know. Grief that specific and that total left marks that didn't fade in any ordinary way. She did not know what he had been before, and she did not know what he was now, and she was going to his home not as a potential wife, but as a woman with knowledge of herbs and sick children, and that at least was clear ground. The ranch, when it came into view through the trees, was larger than she had expected. It was not the sprawling, ostentatious kind of large, not the kind that announced itself, the kind built by men who wanted you to know what they owned. It was the large of a place that had grown as it needed to addition. By addition, barn next to barn, the main house solid and wide, with a porch that wrapped its front and a chimney at each end, putting up wood smoke against the gray sky. The outbuildings were well maintained. The fences were straight. Even under 4 feet of snow, the place communicated order, the kind of order that comes from daily attention rather than one-time investment. Pruitt pulled the wagon around to the side door, which opened before they reached it. The man who came out was tall, several inches over 6 feet, and broad in the way of men who work, not in the way of men who eat well. He wore no coat, though the cold was fierce, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his hands were large and capable looking. The knuckles reddened from water or cold or both. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that was clean-shaven, and a face that was— she noticed this, and noted that she noticed it, not what she had expected from the foreman's careful descriptions. He was not merely weathered or merely worn. He was a man in whom something had been compressed over time, like stone under pressure, until the surface was nearly unreadable. He looked at her without any visible reaction. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Mr. Stone, Gerald tells me you have experience with illness." "Yes." He stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." She came in. The kitchen was warm, large, with good shelving, and a range that was firing well, and a table that could seat 8. There was evidence of recent baking flour still on the board, a cloth-covered rise of bread dough that someone had started and apparently abandoned. There was a smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and underneath it, the particular smell of a sick house, the smell of medicinal tea and closed windows, and the particular altered quality of air when someone in a room above is fighting a fever. "How long has she had the fever?" Jasmine asked, unwrapping her coat. "Since Thursday morning." Stone was already moving toward the stairs. "It peaked yesterday at a number that worried me." "Does she eat?" "She ate a little broth this morning. Before that, nothing since Wednesday." "Is she coughing constantly or in spells?" He paused on the first stair and looked back at her. "Spells. Worse at night. Sitting her up helps. Even partially fold a blanket under the upper mattress if you haven't got a second pillow." She was already in the kitchen setting her purchases from Morrison's on the table, taking inventory. "Hot water. On the stove. Good." She found a pot, a clean cloth, began measuring. "Show me to her when I've prepared this." He stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched her for a moment. She was aware of it, the way you are aware of someone's attention without looking up, and then he said, "She likes to be talked to, not just tended." Jasmine looked up from her work at that. It was an unexpected thing to say, and it told her something about the man that the foreman's careful description had not, that he paid attention to the child, that he knew the difference between being tended to and being talked to, that he thought to pass this information on. Noted, she said. What does she like to talk about? Horses, mostly. Something shifted in his voice, not quite a softening, but a release of some fraction of its habitual tightness. She wants a pony of her own. We haven't sorted that out yet. I know something about horses, Jasmine said. He nodded once as though that settled something and went upstairs. Abigail Stone was small for 11, or perhaps it was the illness making her seem so. She lay in a brass bed with too many quilts pulled to her chin, and the particular flatness of a child who has been sick long enough to forget what feeling well was like. She had her uncle's dark coloring, but none of his compression. Her face was open and readable as a page, and when Jasmine came through the door, she tracked her with eyes that were bright from fever but curious. Are you the doctor? She said. No, I'm Jasmine Monroe. I know some things about being sick. Doc Hennessy says I need rest and fluids. Abigail said this with the resigned precision of someone who has heard it many times and found it insufficient. I've been doing both. Rest and fluids are good, Jasmine agreed. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on the child's forehead, warm, too warm, but not the alarming temperature that preceded a turn for the worse. But there are some other things that might help. She held up the cup she had brought. This is going to taste very much like honey with something underneath it that isn't quite nice. How not quite nice? Like the floor of a forest. Abigail considered this. Is it going to make me better? It's going to make breathing easier, which will let you sleep, which is what actually makes you better. The child studied her with a seriousness that belonged to someone older. My uncle said you came to marry him. From the doorway where Elijah Stone was standing with his arms crossed came a fractional change in the air pressure, the kind that happens when someone becomes very still. I came to meet him, Jasmine said without looking up. The arrangement didn't work out. Why not? That's between him and me. Drink this, please. Abigail drank, her face contracted. You weren't wrong about the floor of the forest. I never am about that. Jasmine took the cup back. Now I'm going to make a chest compress. It'll feel warm and it might smell strange, but it helps the breathing. Have you ever had one before? No. Your mother never. She stopped herself. She did not know what Abigail's mother had been, or where she was, or what the history of this child was, and she had no business asking in the first moment of their acquaintance. But Abigail answered as though she hadn't noticed the stop. My mother died when I was 3. I barely remember her. She said this without drama, the flat reportage of someone who has lived with a fact for so long, it has become simply part of the landscape. Uncle Elijah takes care of me. He seems to do it well. From the doorway came a sound that might have been a brief involuntary exhale. He does, Abigail said seriously. He's not very good at talking about feelings, but he's very good at everything else. Abigail, Stone said from the doorway. I'm not saying anything wrong, the child said with the confidence of someone who has had this disagreement before and knows how it ends. Miss Monroe, are you staying for supper? Jasmine looked at this girl, and then at the man in the doorway, and at the gray winter light coming through the single window of this room, and at the particular combination of circumstances that had landed her here in a sick child's bedroom in a mountain ranch she had not planned to enter, preparing a remedy she had made 100 times. I expect I'll need to stay until the compress is finished and I can see how she responds, she said. After that will depend on the road. Gerald can take you back, Stone said, whenever you're ready. Then let's see how she does, Jasmine said, and went to prepare the compress. She stayed 4 hours, not because the compress required 4 hours, it didn't, but because Abigail Stone was underneath the fever and the cough, an extraordinary child, and because Jasmine found herself engaged in a conversation about horses that began with the child asking if she had ever ridden one and ended with Jasmine describing in considerable detail the temperament of the draft horses her neighbor in Cincinnati had kept, and the way you could tell a horse's mood by the set of its ears, and what it meant when a horse chewed its bit, and a dozen other things she had learned not from books, but from years of patient observation of animals that rewarded patience. Abigail listened the way children listen when they are genuinely interested, which is to say with her whole face asking questions at exactly the right moments. Elijah Stone came in twice during this time, once to bring broth for the child, and once with less explanation, apparently simply to stand in the doorway for a moment before leaving again. The second time Abigail caught Jasmine's eye and gave a look that contained, Jasmine thought, more self-awareness than most adults managed. The compress did its work. By the time the light had entirely gone outside the window, Abigail's breathing was easier and the color in her face was better still warm, but the deep, unhealthy flush replaced by something more manageable. She fell asleep in the middle of a question about whether ponies were harder to train than full-size horses mid-sentence the way very young children and very sick children will, the question simply dissolving into sleep. Jasmine sat for a while after that, watching her breathe. The room was quiet. Downstairs, she could hear the sounds of someone moving in the kitchen, the iron of a stove lid being shifted, the scrape of a pot. She gathered her things without waking the child and went down. Stone was at the range. He was making something she could smell, onion and stock, and he had put on his coat at some point, which suggested he had been outside and come back. He heard her on the stairs and turned. "She's sleeping," Jasmine said. "Breathing much better. The fever's down some. If it climbs again tonight, the same compress with time added here." She had written it on a piece of paper before she left the bedroom, her handwriting small and clear. She set it on the kitchen table. "If it goes higher than it was yesterday, get word to me at the boarding house, and I'll come." He took the paper and looked at it. He did not thank her immediately, which she noticed not as a rudeness, but as a quality. He read what she had written, and then he said, "She hasn't talked that much in weeks." "She's smart," Jasmine said. "Smart children are hard when they're sick because they can't find enough to think about." He looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly, she thought, without the cover of business, not assessing, not defensive, but simply looking in the way of someone trying to understand something. "You didn't have to come," he said. "No," she agreed, "I didn't. I want to be clear that this—" He stopped. "Mr. Stone," she said, and her voice was even, "you don't need to explain anything to me. A child was sick and I had the knowledge to help. That's the beginning and end of it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She had not expected that. She waited. "The arrangement," he said, "calling it off when I did the way I did. By the time I wrote the letter—" He paused. He was a man who did not stumble over words, she thought, but who sometimes had to build his sentences slowly as though the structure required care. "By the time I wrote the letter ending the arrangement, I had reason to believe the telegraph wire to Pueblo was unreliable. I should have considered that and found another way to reach you." "You should have," she said, "but it's done, and I'm here, and the child is better." She picked up her coat from the back of a chair. "Gerald said he could take me back whenever I was ready. He's in the bunkhouse. I'll get him." "Don't wake him if he's settled in," she said. "I can wait. He's not sleeping." Stone moved toward the back door, then stopped. "There's soup if you haven't eaten." She had not eaten since midday breakfast. The soup smelled like something she would have made herself given the same ingredients. "Thank you," she said. She sat at the large kitchen table and ate his soup, which was better than she expected from a man who lived alone. And she looked around at the kitchen that was both orderly and somehow lonely. The good pots in good condition, the shelves stocked and organized, but nothing soft anywhere. No cloth on the table, no flowers, even dried. Nothing that suggested anyone lived here who was not simply maintaining. She was halfway through the bowl when she heard him come back in through the rear of the house. "He'll be ready in 10 minutes, he said. She nodded. He did not sit. He stood near the range with a cup of something and looked at the wall. "The town," she said, because silence between them was not uncomfortable precisely, but it was loaded. "I've been walking it these past 3 days. Several buildings are empty." He looked at her. "Has that been recent?" she said. "The Bakers left in August, the Perez's in October, the Holloways, the older Holloways before that." He lifted his cup. 3 other families over the past year." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "The mine closed 4 years ago. Most of what kept this town fed was the mine and what it bought. Now there's ranching, some trade, but the railroad passes 15 miles south of here, and the freight rates for getting anything in or out have made it hard for the small merchants." He paused. "It's difficult to hold a community together when the economics are working against it. Is that why you canceled the arrangement?" He looked at her again. "The economic difficulty," she said. "Did it factor into your thinking?" The pause was longer this time. "Partly," he said. "There were other reasons." She did not push. She was not a woman who pushed at closed doors. She heard the wagon being brought around outside, and she finished her soup and stood and put on her coat. "The recipe I left," she said. "Follow it exactly, and let her talk about horses. She'll heal faster with something to think about. I'll send word if she worsens." "Please do." She picked up her bag. At the door, she turned back. "Mr. Stone." He looked at her. "The arrangement may be ended," she said, "but I'm still here until the pass opens. If Abigail wants company, I'm happy to come." She saw something move across his face. Not surprise exactly, but its quieter cousin. The adjustment that happens when a thing you expected does not materialize and something else appears in its place. "I'll let her know," he said. Jasmine went out into the cold and Pruitt drove her back to town. Abigail did not worsen. Jasmine knew this because Gerald Pruitt came to the boarding house 2 mornings later, not with news of crisis, but with a note from the child written in a firm, slightly oversized hand on good stationery. "Dear Miss Monroe, I am much better. Uncle Elijah made the compress 3 times exactly as you wrote it, and my breathing is almost entirely normal again. I would like to show you the horses when you have time. Please come on a day when the weather is good. Your friend Abigail Stone, your friend." Jasmine read it twice and felt the specific warmth of that, the uncomplicated wholesale offering of a child's friendship, which is among the most direct and dignified forms of connection there is. She wrote back. She said she would come on Saturday, weather willing. The weather on Saturday was not good, but it was not bad. A gray, still day with no new snow, the kind of day that felt like a rest between storms. Pruitt came for her in the wagon again, and this time the drive north felt different. Less like going towards something uncertain, and more like going somewhere she had in some small way already been. She brought bread. She had baked it herself in Mrs. Aldicott's kitchen that morning, a loaf of the honey wheat that her mother had made on Saturdays with caraway seeds, because she had them the kind of bread that smelled like home, even when home was the wrong word for where you were. Abigail met her at the side door and took one of her bags without asking, in the manner of a child who has been raised to help with things, and her face when she smelled the bread was uncomplicated pleasure. "Did you make that?" "I did, with honey and caraway." "What's caraway?" "I'll show you when we cut it," Jasmine said. They went in. The kitchen was warmer today, and someone she thought it must have been Pruitt or one of the ranch hands had brought in a quantity of wood that was stacked neatly by the range. There was coffee on the stove and the table was clean. Of Elijah Stone there was no sign. Abigail noticed her notice. "He's out on the South Range," she said with the matter-of-fact reporting of someone who keeps track of the household. "He said he'd be back by midday." Jasmine unwrapped her coat. "Then let's start with the horses and work back to the bread." The barn was warm in the way of large animal spaces, the collected heat of horse bodies and hay, and the particular interior weather of a well-built structure. There were 6 horses in the main stalls, and Jasmine knew enough to recognize quality stock of bay gelding with the wide chest and long pasterns of cavalry breeding. 2 sorrels that looked to be working horses, sturdy and honest-faced. A gray mare who regarded Jasmine with the calm suspicion of an animal that has decided to wait and see. And then in the last stall a smaller horse. Not a pony, but smaller than the others, a dun perhaps 14 hands with a pale mane and a face that was inquisitive in the way of certain horses that have decided the world is interesting rather than threatening. Abigail had stopped at this stall without Jasmine having to guess why. "She doesn't have a name yet," Abigail said. "Uncle Elijah said I could name her when she's properly mine. He said that'll be in the spring." She looked at the horse, who looked back with bright, interested eyes. "I've been thinking about it for 2 months. What have you considered?" Abigail listed. She had considered, she said, Bluebell dismissed because the horse was clearly not the sort of horse who was a Bluebell and Juniper good, but it felt like a tree name more than a horse name. And Clara too plain, and Honey too obvious. And Solstice, she had to explain that one. Her school reader had a chapter about the seasons, and she had liked the word. She had also considered more briefly Duchess and Arabella, both of which she had rejected on the grounds that the horse didn't seem like she was trying to be anything. "What does she seem like?" Jasmine asked. Abigail considered the horse for a long moment. The horse considered Abigail with the same patient attention. "Like someone who's just arrived somewhere and isn't sure yet but thinks it might be good," Abigail said. Jasmine looked at this child, and then at the horse, and then at the child again. "That's not a bad description of a name," she said. "But it's not a name. Not yet." Jasmine reached into her pocket and produced a small piece of dried apple she had brought. On the instinct she always carried something for horses. Her Cincinnati neighbor had trained her to it. She offered it to the dun, who took it with the deliberate politeness of an animal who was not greedy but was not foolish. "Arrival," she said. "Promise. Threshold." Abigail's mouth moved on the last one. "Threshold. It means the place between one thing and the next." "I know what it means." She said it not rudely, but as a matter of factual accuracy. She was the kind of child who knew what words meant. "Threshold." She tried it on the horse. "Threshold, do you like carrots?" The horse's ears moved. "She likes threshold," Abigail said, with the certainty of someone who has reached a conclusion and will not revisit it. Then Threshold she is, Jasmine said. They were still at the horse's stall, Abigail explaining the process by which she intended to teach Threshold to ground tie when Jasmine heard the main barn door open and felt the draft of cold air and turned to see Elijah Stone come in. He was covered in snow from the shoulders up, the way a man gets when he has been working in falling snow rather than riding through it, and he was pulling off his gloves with the practiced motion of someone whose hands are very cold. He stopped when he saw them. She named the horse, Jasmine said. He looked at his niece. Threshold, Abigail said, because she's at the beginning of something. Something crossed Stone's face then, not quite a smile, not quite the precursor of one, but the shadow of both. He pulled the last glove off and shoved it in his coat pocket and looked at the dun horse, who looked back with equanimity. Threshold, he said. Don't you like it? I like it. He looked at Jasmine briefly, then away. I didn't hear the wagon. Gerald brought me while you were out. I wasn't sure when you'd be back. The south fence needed checking. We've had some drift that was pulling the posts. He was working the fingers of his right hand, the knuckles obviously stiff from cold. I'll be in after I check the hay in the far stall. He moved past them down the barn. Jasmine watched him go, noting the rigidity in his right hand, the way he favored it slightly. His hands get very stiff in the cold, Abigail said quietly, watching her uncle. He doesn't say anything about it. No, Jasmine said, he wouldn't. They went in for bread. The bread was something. She knew objectively that she baked well, had known it since she was 10 years old, and her mother had let her take over the Saturday baking entirely, and the neighbors had begun to find reasons to visit on Saturday afternoons. But knowing a thing in the abstract and watching it work in a particular room on a particular winter afternoon are different experiences, and what she watched happen around Mrs. Aldicott's bread that afternoon was something she had seen before in different kitchens, but that never got old. Abigail ate 2 pieces before the meal and did not apologize for it. Pruitt, who had apparently been talked into staying for midday meal, ate 3. Even Stone, who ate with the focused practicality of a man who considers food fuel, ate a full slice with butter and paused over it in a way that was as close, she suspected, as he came to visible appreciation. The caraway, Abigail said, holding up a seed on her fingertip. That's the thing. That's the thing. It's a seed. It is. From what? A plant in the carrot family. It grows across Europe mostly, though some people grow it here. She watched Abigail turn the seed in the light. Your uncle's wife, did she bake? The table went quiet in a specific way. She had not thought before she asked it, and she felt the error immediately, not because the question was wrong exactly, but because of the particular quality of the silence that followed it. Not angry, not offended, simply the silence of a wound that has been covered carefully for a long time and does not like being near uncovered things. She did, Abigail said in a careful voice. Mrs. Pruitt told me. I don't really remember her. I'm sorry, Jasmine said. I shouldn't have asked without thinking. It's all right, Abigail said. From the far end of the table, Stone said nothing, but he set down his bread and looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then he reached for the bread again, and Jasmine thought that might be the most she was going to know about the subject for a long time, and she was content with that. After the meal, Pruitt went back to the bunkhouse. Abigail claimed a chair by the parlor stove to read with the focused remove of a child who is very comfortable with books and knows exactly how to use a book to excuse herself from adult conversation. Stone stayed in the kitchen, and Jasmine, rather than sit in the parlor and be useless, began to wash up. He did not tell her not to. He watched for a moment, and then he picked up a drying cloth, and they worked in silence, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable between people who are both accustomed to working and not accustomed to explaining themselves while they do it. The town, she said when the soup pot was done. Are there other people doing what you're doing, trying to hold it together? He was quiet for a moment. Reverend Marsh, the Morrison family at the general store. Mrs. Aldicott. But not enough. No. He dried the pot and hung it back. It's not enough. What would be enough? He looked at her. More than we have. That's not an answer. He was quiet again. Then, if we had a way to get goods to market reliably and a reason for young families to stay in a school that could keep a teacher, those 3 things. Those 3 things, and this town would survive. And without them, his hands were still on the pot hook. Without them, it doesn't survive. Not in any meaningful way. Maybe a few families hold on, maybe someone buys the land and runs cattle, but the town... He stopped. No. Jasmine dried her hands on the cloth. She looked at the kitchen wall where someone had once painted a border vines, faded now, but you could still see the pattern, the kind of detail a woman might have added years ago. Then those are the problems to solve, she said. He looked at her with something she could not entirely name. Not dismissal, but a kind of careful consideration. The way a man who has thought about something a long time looks at someone who has just said a simple thing about it. Miss Monroe, he said, you're waiting for the pass to open. Yes, this isn't your problem. No, she agreed, but I'm here. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he folded the drying cloth and hung it and said, I need to check on the horses before dark. Of course, she said. He went out. Jasmine went to the parlor and sat with Abigail and her book, and outside the window the light went from pale to gray to the deep dark blue of a mountain evening. And she thought about the word Abigail had given the dun horse. Threshold. She thought precisely at one herself. She just didn't know yet which way she was going to step. Pruitt drove her back to town in the early dark. The horses moving sure-footed on the snow-packed road, the stars beginning to assert themselves in the gaps between clouds. He was a companionable silence in the wagon seat beside her, the kind of man who understood that not every journey required conversation. About halfway to town, he said, She's better, Miss Monroe, Abigail, better than she's been in a good while. She's a healthy child fighting a manageable illness, Jasmine said. She'll be completely well in another week. I don't just mean the cough, Pruitt said. Jasmine looked at the road ahead, the dark line of it between the white fields. Mr. Stone, Pruitt had said after a moment, is a good man. He's had a hard several years since Margaret. His wife. He stopped. I don't mean to speak out of turn. You're not, she said. Not yet. He stopped the arrangement because he doesn't trust himself, Pruitt said. Not because there was anything wrong with you. He hasn't seen your letters even. He asked me to handle all of it after the first one. He stopped again, then decided to go on. He thought it wasn't fair to bring a woman out here to what the town's becoming. A dying town. Maybe not dying, Pruitt said. Not quite yet, but close enough to see it from here. The lights of Harlan's Creek were appearing below them through the trees. He's not wrong that it's hard, Pruitt said. I want to be clear. It is hard, but... He shook his head. I've known Elijah Stone for 11 years. He's the reason this ranch is what it is. He's the reason half those families in town stayed as long as they did. He fixed Martin Casper's fence for free for 3 winters running. He bought the Morrison boys' school books for 2 years when the family couldn't manage it. He doesn't talk about these things. He doesn't talk about most things. I've noticed, Jasmine said. He's a good man, Pruitt said again, as though the repetition made it more true. I just thought you ought to know. She did not know what to say to that exactly, so she said nothing. She watched the lights of the town come closer through the dark, and she thought about good men who had stopped trusting themselves and what that cost, and whether it was a thing that could be undone. She didn't know. She didn't know what she was doing here, or what was going to happen when the pass opened, or whether there was anything to be done about any of it. But she was going to make bread again on Saturday, and she was going to visit a child who had named her horse Threshold, and she was going to keep her eyes open, because that was the only thing she knew how to do with a situation she didn't yet understand. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Yeah. The weeks that followed the first storm were not quiet, but they had a particular quality of suspension about them, the quality of a held breath of a world waiting. The pass remained closed. The train did not run. Harlan's Creek turned inward, as small towns do in winter, relying on what it had stored and who it had, and the thousand small negotiations of community survival. Jasmine became in this period something she had not planned useful. It started with the bread. She baked on Tuesdays and Thursdays in Mrs. Aldicott's kitchen, and the bread was always good, and news of good bread travels in a small town, the way news of bad things also travels completely without anyone organizing it. On the 3rd Thursday, 2 women came to the door while she was still finishing the last loaves, and one of them, a woman named Sarah Toland, the mother of the boy whose croup she'd helped with, asked if she'd be willing to sell any because her own oven had developed a crack in the firebox, and her husband was waiting on a part that wouldn't come until the pass opened. Jasmine sold her 2 loaves at a fair price and said she'd bring more next Thursday. By the 2nd week of this arrangement, there were 4 families buying bread, and by the 3rd, there were 7, and Jasmine was baking 5 days a week, and the money, while not substantial, was hers, which was more than she had expected to have at this particular juncture of her life. The cooking expanded. She was already helping with Mrs. Aldicott's evening meals, which the landlady accepted with a combination of genuine gratitude and the mild determination of someone who wants it, understood that accepting help is not the same as needing it. Jasmine understood this perfectly and navigated it with care, finding the balance between contributing and taking over, which was a narrower balance than most people realize. One morning, very cold, a woman knocked on Mrs. Aldicott's front door with a child on her hip and a face that was trying very hard to be composed and not entirely succeeding. Her name was Clara Winslow. Her husband worked one of the remaining small ranches east of town, and she had not eaten, she admitted, since yesterday morning because they had miscalculated their winter supplies and the flour was nearly gone, and the nearest way to more was the pass. Jasmine put her in the kitchen, made her coffee and eggs, and while Clara Winslow ate, she sat across from her and they talked. Not about charity, not about hardship. They talked about Clara's mother in Missouri, who made a particular kind of cornbread that Clara hadn't been able to replicate, and about the child on her hip, a girl of perhaps 18 months with fine dark hair and an expression of complete serenity, and about whether next spring would bring better prices for beef. Before Clara Winslow left, Jasmine gave her a 20-pound sack of flour from her own supply and a list of what she could make with it through the winter. Clara took both with the careful dignity of someone who knows how to accept help without losing herself, which Jasmine recognized because she had been on both sides of that kind of moment. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said at the door. "Come back Thursday," Jasmine said. "I'm teaching Mrs. Aldicott's neighbor to make proper soup stock. You'd be welcome." She was not entirely sure she had planned to do this, but the words were out, and Clara Winslow's face was doing something that suggested the words had been the right ones, and so Jasmine simply moved forward as though she had planned it all along. The Thursday soup session became a standing arrangement. 3 women the first week, 5 the second. They brought what they had: dried beans, a piece of smoked pork root vegetables that were the end of their cellars, and Jasmine showed them what to do with it. Not in the manner of an instructor, which would have been wrong, but in the manner of someone doing a job alongside other people who are curious about how the job is done. She listened too. That was the part people didn't always know to notice, that when you're teaching someone to make soup stock, you're also in a room with them for 2 hours. And people in rooms together for 2 hours talk. And what they say, if you listen, is the actual shape of what their lives are. She learned through this listening that the school had lost one of its 2 teachers in October, a young woman who had taken a position in Denver because Denver could pay twice what Harlan's Creek could offer and was not in danger of disappearing. The remaining teacher, a Mr. Beaumont, was managing all 40 children in a single room and managing it badly by the accounts she heard, not because he was a poor teacher, but because he was one person and there were 40 children in one room and not enough books. She learned that the Morrison family's general store was operating on credit. It couldn't repay that they had extended lines to families who were struggling and were now struggling themselves, and that Roy Morrison had been talking to the railroad investor, Victor Grayson, whose name she heard with increasing frequency, always in the same tone. Careful, watchful, the tone people use when they are afraid of something, but haven't decided yet whether to be afraid or not. She learned that the livery owner, a man named Pete Duvall, had been looking at his lease and wondering whether the feed costs through the winter would leave him anything by spring. She learned that 3 of the remaining businesses on the main street had received letters from their Denver-based landlords suggesting that leases might not be renewed. She learned these things, and she kept them. She was still in her own assessment of visitor, a temporary one waiting for the pass. She had no right to these people's lives and no stake in their troubles beyond the ordinary stake any human being has in the troubles of other human beings, which is to say, not a small stake, but not the kind that comes with voting rights either. But she kept what she learned and she thought about it, and on the Sunday afternoons when the boarding house was quiet and Mrs. Aldicott dozed by the parlor stove, Jasmine sat at the kitchen table with her mother's journals and a piece of paper and wrote down what she knew about each problem and what she could imagine might address it. She was doing this on the 3rd Sunday in December when the front door opened and Elijah Stone came in. She heard his voice low and quiet in the front hallway, and Mrs. Aldicott's answering voice, and then boots on the floor, and Stone appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had come, he said, to check on her. He was in town on business and had thought the sentence ended without completing itself. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat. He was not a man who sat easily in domestic spaces. She noticed not because he was awkward in them, but because he held himself with the same quality of attention indoors that she imagined he held outdoors, always slightly ready to stand to move, to be needed somewhere else. He looked at her papers on the table with a glance that was curious but not intrusive. She made the coffee and brought it and sat across from him. He looked at the papers. "May I?" She turned them toward him. He was quiet for a while, reading. She watched his face, which was a face that did not announce what it thought, but that registered things, the small shifts of someone whose mind is working. You've talked to most of the town, he said. People talk when they're making soup. The school, he said. You know about Beaumont. I know he's overwhelmed. He's thinking about leaving, come spring. He set the papers down. That's the one that, if the school closes, the families with children don't stay. I know. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I can't run a school. I'm not suggesting, but I can help in it. She had been thinking about this. I'm not a trained teacher, but I know enough mathematics to help the younger children, and I can read and I know history and I know... She stopped. I'm not trained, but if Mr. Beaumont needs a second body in the room who can manage the 6- and 7-year-olds while he works with the older students, he'd take it, Stone said. He'd take it without question. She looked at her coffee cup. It would mean staying. The word sat between them. Staying. The pass will open in March, Stone said. Possibly February if the weather cooperates. Yes, you were planning to... He did not complete this sentence either. I had not decided what I was planning, she said, which was true. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Abigail asks about you. I know, I went out again last week. She showed you the mayor. She did. The mayor had been introduced with a formality that would have been amusing if it weren't also wholly sincere Abigail presenting Threshold as one might present a very dear friend. She's a good horse. She is. He drank his coffee. Abigail hasn't talked that much since... He stopped. Since when, he didn't say. In a long time. Jasmine looked at him at the particular set of his face when he was being careful. You don't have to pretend your wife didn't exist, she said quietly. I understand it's painful, but Abigail talks about her sometimes and I think she needs to be able to. He was very still. She was 3 when her mother died, Jasmine said. She doesn't have enough memories to work from. When she talks about your wife, she's trying to build a picture of a woman she can barely reach. His hands around the coffee cup were large and still. You don't need to tell me about Margaret, he said finally. I'm not suggesting that. But when Abigail brings her up, you might rather than the silence. I know, he said. His voice was quiet, not angry, the kind of quiet that is the surface of something much deeper than anger. I know. She let it be. She would not push it, and she did not need to. She had said the thing that needed saying, and what he did with it was his to work out. They finished the coffee. He stood to leave. At the door, he put on his coat and his hat, and then turned back the way he had a habit of doing, as though there was always one more thing located somewhere between leaving and gone. The arrangement, he said. She waited. I was wrong to end it as I did. He was looking at the doorframe. I told myself I ended it for practical reasons, for the town's sake, for hers. He paused. But the real reason was that I was afraid. She said nothing. I don't know what to do with that information, he said. I'm not suggesting anything. I just wanted you to know. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said, for telling me. He nodded once, put on his hat, and went out into the cold. Jasmine stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. Then she turned back to her papers and her coffee and the particular shape of the problem she had been mapping, and she let Elijah Stone's admission sit where it had landed and did not try to pick it up yet. Some things needed time to be understood. She was patient. She had learned patience the way you learn most important things, not from books, but from situations that required it. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain, and the snow fell again, and Harlan's Creek settled into its winter quiet and waited. Victor Grayson arrived in Harlan's Creek on the 1st of February. He came in a private coach, not the stage which stopped 3 miles south at the Ridgeline Junction, but his own vehicle pulled by matched chestnuts and driven by a man who wore a town coat in the mountain cold with the studied indifference of someone who was being paid enough that comfort was not the point. The coach was black and clean and had a small brass monogram on the door, the G done in a style that announced its owner without quite descending to vulgarity. The pass had not opened yet, but the private road south through the lower range was passable with the right vehicle and enough money, and Grayson by all accounts had both. Jasmine was in the schoolroom when the coach passed the window she had been for 3 weeks, by then spending Tuesday and Thursday mornings with Mr. Beaumont's younger students, teaching them their letters and numbers with the careful patience of someone who likes children and likes the problem of transmitting knowledge and finds the combination pleasant. She saw the coach from the corner of her eye and turned to look, and so did 6 children between the ages of 5 and 8, with the instinctive attention of the young for anything unusual. And Mr. Beaumont himself looked up from his older students. "Is that Mr. Grayson?" said one of the children, a boy named Thomas Casper with the wide-set eyes and direct manner of his father. "It appears to be a coach," Jasmine said. "Thomas, please look back at your slate." "Papa says Mr. Grayson wants to buy our house," Thomas Casper said, not looking at his slate. Thomas. He looked at his slate. She heard more about Victor Grayson at supper. Mrs. Aldicott, who had not become the keeper of the most frequented boarding house in Harlan's Creek by being uninformed, had encountered him already. He had walked through the door of her establishment, at 4 o'clock introduced himself without any particular warmth, and inquired about a room. She had given him one because she was a businesswoman, and rooms were rooms, but she had given him, Jasmine noted, the one on the north side that didn't catch the morning light. "He's polite," Mrs. Aldicott said, setting a dish of roast pork on the table. "The way something sharp is polite when it's in its sheath." Holloway, the mine surveyor, who was still waiting out the weather, looked up from his plate. "Grayson, railroad man." "Investor," Mrs. Aldicott corrected. "Not the same thing, though he'd like you to think it is. He doesn't build the railroad. He buys the land the railroad needs and sells it to the railroad. And he buys the land the railroad doesn't need from people who don't know yet that the railroad doesn't need it." "Is there a difference?" Holloway said. "The first kind makes money. The second kind makes money and also acquires property." She sat down. "He's been circling this town for 2 years. I've been waiting." Jasmine served herself and thought about what she knew, which was this. The railroad's southern route through the lower range was the route that currently passed 15 miles from Harlan's Creek, making freight expensive and regular trade difficult. The northern route, which would have passed through or very near the town, had been surveyed but not built. And Jasmine had heard enough in her weeks of kitchen conversations to understand that the northern route was more expensive, and that the expense was the official reason it had not been built. Whether the expense was the actual reason was a question that sat in the back of her mind without an answer. "What does he want?" she asked. "What he always wants," Mrs. Aldicott said. "Everything at a price people will accept because they don't believe there's another option." She met Grayson the next morning. He was in the dining room when she came down, seated at the table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper that had come with him in the coach, yesterday's Denver paper, which was still fresher than anything that reached Harlan's Creek by normal means. He was 52, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth, and was now distinguished, the jaw firm, and the eyes pale and very still, the sort of stillness that is not peace but watchfulness. He stood when she came in. A trained reflex, the manners were automatic, the kind of manners that have been so thoroughly practiced they've ceased to cost anything. "You must be Miss Monroe," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know my name?" "I make it my business to know who's in a town before I arrive." He sat again with her implicit permission as she took her own seat at the table. "You've been here since December. You're the bride who came to marry Elijah Stone." "I was a woman who had a correspondence with Mr. Stone about a possible arrangement," she said. "The arrangement didn't proceed, but you stayed. I was trapped by weather. And you've been teaching in the school," he said, "and providing bread to 7 families, and organizing cooking sessions for the women and—" "Mr. Grayson," she said, "you've been in this town for 16 hours. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that indicates acknowledgement of a point rather than genuine amusement. "I've been paying attention to this town for longer than that." "What can I do for you?" she said. "Nothing at the moment. I was curious about you." He returned to his newspaper. "I find I'm usually curious about the people who are trying to do what can't be done." "What can't be done?" He looked at her over the edge of the paper. "Save a town that the economics have already left behind," he said. "Bread is good, Miss Monroe. Soup sessions are admirable, but they don't address the root problem." "Which is?" "Capital," he said, "and access. You can't sustain a community without them. Harlan's Creek doesn't have capital and its access is limited and increasingly expensive. Those are not things that can be solved with bread." She looked at him for a moment. "What's your solution?" "Consolidation," he said. "The land is beautiful. The timber has value. The water rights along the creek are not nothing. If the right entity owned all of it, or most of it, the economics become very different." "The right entity being—" Another small smile. "I'm having conversations," he said. "This is a preliminary visit." He went back to his newspaper. Jasmine ate her breakfast and thought about what he had said and what he had not said, and what the difference was between a man who wanted to save a town and a man who wanted to buy one. She thought the difference was considerable, and she thought he knew it, and she thought the courtesy he offered her was the kind that comes with a very particular intention, the intention to be remembered as reasonable in the event of future disagreements. Stone came to town that afternoon. He had heard about Grayson. News in a small town with limited visitors move faster than most things, and Gerald Pruitt had apparently ridden ahead of the official information. Stone tied his horse at the hitching post outside Morrison's general store and went in, and Jasmine, who was coming up the street from the school, saw him from 50 yards and changed her course. He was already in conversation with Roy Morrison when she came through the door. Roy, who was a large, deliberate man with an honest face and the slightly haunted look of someone managing a mathematics problem that doesn't quite resolve. Stone stood beside him at the counter with his hat in his hand. "Miss Monroe," Stone said when he heard the bell above the door. "Mr. Stone," she looked at Roy, "has he introduced himself to you yet?" Roy Morrison's jaw tightened fractionally. "Yesterday evening. Came in, bought a sack of coffee, spent 45 minutes looking at my account books." "Your account books?" He asked to see them. Roy's voice carried a quality of incredulity that had aged past its peak and settled into something harder. "I don't know why I showed him." "Because he had a manner about it that made you feel like not showing them was unreasonable," Jasmine said. Roy looked at her. "Yes, exactly like that." She looked at Stone. "He won't have found anything to use," Stone said. "The store's accounts are—" He glanced at Roy. "In order," Roy said, with the careful emphasis of a man to whom being in order is a point of personal honor, even when being in order is its own kind of strain. "But not he knows how close to the margin we're running." "He already knew," Stone said. "That's why he asked to see the books. He wanted to know if you knew how close to the margin you are." Roy stared at him. "He's not here to find information," Stone said. "He's here to see how much of what he already has can be confirmed." He looked at Jasmine. "Have you spoken to him?" "At breakfast," she said. "He knows who I am. He knew before he arrived." The three of them stood for a moment in the general store with its smell of coffee and dry goods and the particular smell of well-worn wooden floors. While outside the window, the winter light went about its short business, and the few people visible on the main street moved quickly hunched against the cold. "What does he want?" Roy said. "Specifically." "He wants the town," Stone said. "The land, the water rights, the timber claims. He'll offer good money to each property owner individually, and individually, it'll seem reasonable. And when enough people have sold, he'll own enough that the rest will feel they have to." "And what will he do with it?" "I don't know yet." Stone's voice was flat. "Whatever it is, it won't be a town. Not the kind we have." Roy leaned on his counter and looked at his hands. "Elijah," he said quietly, "I'm 3 months from not being able to pay my suppliers." "I know. I have a wife and 4 children." "I know, Roy." "I'm not saying I'll sell," Roy said. I'm saying I understand why some people will." Stone looked at him, and Jasmine saw something in Stone's face that she had not seen there before. Not resignation, not defeat, but a recognition, the look of a man who has been carrying a weight long enough to know its exact dimensions. "Then we have to give people a reason to stay," Stone said, "before he gives them a reason to go." "What reason?" "I don't know yet," Stone said. He looked at Jasmine. "Not entirely." She met his gaze. In it was something that had not been there 3 weeks ago. A question that was not quite a question, the beginning of something that hadn't yet been named. "The women I've been cooking with," she said, 8 of them between them know every household in this town. Who's close to leaving, who might stay if something changed, what the specific pressures are." She paused. "If we knew what it would take to make staying more possible, specifically, not generally, you'd need to know what each family needs," Stone said. "Yes, that's not—" He stopped, reconsidered. "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it isn't." Roy Morrison looked between them with the expression of a man who has just realized he is watching something he doesn't entirely understand, but which seems important. "I can talk to my wife," he said. "She knows things I don't." "Good," Jasmine said. "Have her come Thursday." Thursday's session was larger than any previous 111 women, the biggest gathering yet, and not only because of the soup. Clara Winslow came, and the Casper wives both, and Maria Sandoval, who kept the boarding house laundry going, and spoke with an accent that suggested she was not from here originally, and had found her way here, and stayed for reasons that had outlasted the reasons. And Helen Beaumont, the schoolteacher's wife, who had not come before, who was quiet and watchful, and clearly very tired. Jasmine taught them a particular bean soup that stretched a little protein across a lot of servings, and while they cooked, she asked questions. Not the leading kind. Simple questions, the kind that open doors. What do your children need most this winter? What would make the difference between staying and going? If the school stayed open and improved, would that change your thinking? She listened. When the soup was done and the women were eating at Mrs. Aldicott's big kitchen table, she said, I want to tell you all something, and then I want to hear what you think. They looked at her. Victor Grayson is here to buy this town, she said. He won't say it quite that way. He'll make individual offers that seem reasonable, and he'll let people make their own choices. But he's buying toward a threshold when he owns enough, the rest of you will feel you have no choice. That's how this works. The room was quiet. He may not be wrong that the economics are against us, she said. He's right that bread doesn't fix capital access. He's right that without a way to get goods to market and a reason for families to stay, the town doesn't survive. She looked around the table. But he's not the only solution. What's the other solution? Helen Beaumont said. Her voice was tired. Us, Jasmine said, which she knew sounded insufficient and which she therefore didn't let stand alone. Specifically, the ranches north of town together have enough cattle to justify a cooperative freight arrangement with the Ridgeline Junction. If we pool together and negotiate our own freight rates instead of each family trying to move goods individually, the cost per family drops significantly. She had worked this out the previous Sunday with the careful arithmetic her mother had taught her. The numbers work if the ranches cooperate. The ranches have never cooperated on anything, said one of the Casper wives. There's a first time, Jasmine said. Elijah Stone would have to agree, said another voice. Yes, Jasmine said, he would. She looked around the table again. I'm not from here, I know that. But I've been watching what's here and there is something here worth keeping. Not the buildings can be replaced. The people. The way you know each other. The way you showed up when the Tolans had the fire in October, how 12 families were there within an hour. She had heard this story from 3 different people. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Helen Beaumont set down her spoon. She looked at Jasmine for a long moment. You're planning to stay, she said. It was not quite a question. I'm planning to help, Jasmine said, for as long as I can help. She told Stone about the cooperative freight idea on the following Saturday when she rode out to the ranch. He was in the barn when she arrived. Pruitt had met her at the door and pointed, and she found him working on a piece of harness leather with methodical attention, his hands moving with the certain economy of someone who has done this kind of work so many times, it has passed through skill into something closer to instinct. Abigail was with Threshold in the next stall, engaged in an ongoing negotiation about whether Threshold would accept having her mane braided, which Threshold was tolerating with the ambivalent patience of an animal that had decided this particular human was worth the indignity. Jasmine came in out of the cold and unwrapped her coat and sat down on the hay bale across from Stone and told him about the freight cooperative. He listened. He did not interrupt, which she had learned to expect of him. He was not a man who talked over people or ahead of them, and listening to him listen was a particular experience, because you could tell that the listening was real, not performative. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning the harness leather in his hands. The Hendersons won't agree, he said. Why not? Old argument with the Caspers about a fence line. It's been going on for 11 years. Over a fence? Over principle, he said. The fence is the object, the principle is something else. What principle? He glanced at her. There was something in the look that was not quite amusement, but was its neighbor. The principle that Henderson was right in 1877 and can prove it. Can he? Probably. Then let him prove it, she said. Let him be right, and then ask if he'd like to join the cooperative. Stone looked at her. Being right and moving forward are not mutually exclusive, she said. You just have to let the right happen first. He turned the leather over again. You've done this before. What? Manage people, he said. Groups of people who don't want to cooperate. You've done it before. I managed my mother for 4 years while she was sick, she said. She was a very independent woman and she didn't like needing help, and there was a constant negotiation between what she needed and what she was willing to accept. He was quiet. It taught me, she said, that people will accept almost anything if they feel their dignity has been maintained. And how do you maintain Henderson's dignity while telling him he was right about a fence line? By making sure he's the one who tells people he was right, she said. Not you, not me, him. He sat with this for a moment. Then he nodded a single slow nod that was both agreement and something larger, the acknowledgement of a kind of thinking he was recognizing. The cooperative would need Caspers and Hendersons both, he said, and the Millers east of the creek, and the Delacroix place if they haven't given up yet. Have they? Not yet. Then we have something to work with, she said. From the next stall came Abigail's voice, patient and firm. Threshold, I'm not going to hurt you. It's braiding, not battle. Stone looked toward the sound, and that fractional thing happened on his face again, the shadow of something lighter there, and then not quite there. She's been better, he said, since you started coming. She's a good child, Jasmine said. She doesn't need much. She needs people to talk to and things to think about. She needs a— He stopped. A woman in the house, Jasmine said without making it anything more than what it was. He looked at her. I wasn't going to put it that way. But that's what you meant. He was quiet for a moment. Among other things, he set the harness down. Miss Monroe. Jasmine, she said. He looked at her, and in that look was the careful quality of a man picking his way across uncertain ground. Jasmine, he said. Yes. I would like to— He stopped again. He was not— She was coming to understand a man who did this because he didn't know his own mind. He did it because he was careful with words in the way he was careful with everything he wanted what he said to be accurate, not merely true. I would like to begin again, he said, if that's possible, if it's still something you would consider. Outside, the wind moved through the barn timbers, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and somewhere a door needed latching, and the iron voice of winter was having its say against the boards. She sat with the question, not because she didn't know what she thought, but because she respected the weight of it, and she thought he would understand the pause. I would consider it, she said, slowly. Yes, he said immediately, as though slowly was the answer he had hoped for, because slowly meant actually. I'm not leaving in February, she said. Whatever happens with the pass, I'm staying until the cooperative is established at least, and until the school situation is resolved. I know. And I'm going to keep baking bread and cooking soup and talking to people and trying to solve problems that are probably not mine to solve. I know. So we'll have time, she said. Yes, he said. From the next stall, Abigail said in a tone of satisfaction, There. Was that so terrible? Threshold nickered, which was open to interpretation. The cooperative took 6 weeks to organize, and it was not easy. Nothing worth organizing ever was in Jasmine's experience, and she had not expected it to be easy, but she had also not quite expected the specific texture of the difficulty, which was not the opposition she had anticipated, but rather the weight of habit and suspicion, and old wounds that had been carried so long they had become part of the carrying. Stone went to the Henderson Ranch on a Tuesday. He went alone on horseback, and he was gone most of the day, and when he came back he had a particular set to his jaw that suggested the day had cost him something. He was right about the fence, Stone said. Did you tell him that— I confirmed what he already knew. That's the same thing. He looked at her. Is it? Yes, she said. He's not stupid. He knows the difference between someone agreeing with him and someone conceding a point because it's strategically useful. If you went out there and told him he was right, he knows you meant it or he knows you didn't, and he'll decide based on who you are. Who am I? He said, not dramatically but with genuine inquiry. A man who's honest about things that cost him, she said, which is why he'll believe you. Stone was quiet for a moment. He'll think about the cooperative, he said. He said to give him a week. Good. He also said— Stone paused. He asked who thought of it. She said nothing. I told him, Stone said. She looked at him. I told him it was your idea and that you'd been in town since December and that you'd spent 6 weeks talking to every family in Harlan's Creek about what they needed to stay. He paused. He said he'd heard of you. He said his wife bought bread on Thursdays. I know Mrs. Henderson, Jasmine said. She's been coming to the soup sessions. He said that too. Something was happening in Stone's voice that she had not heard before, something that was warmer than his usual measure. He said, whatever you're doing, it's working. She looked at her hands for a moment. I'm just talking to people. You're just listening to people, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. I've been trying, he said carefully, to think about how many times in the last year I could have done that. Just listened and didn't. He was looking at the window, the familiar posture of a man dealing with what he is rather than what he wishes he were. Roy Morrison tried to tell me how close to the edge he was 6 months ago. I gave him practical advice. I didn't listen to the actual thing he was saying, which was that he was scared. Stone said it simply. He was scared and he wanted someone to know. You know now, she said. Late, he said. Not too late. He looked at her. You don't know that. No, she admitted, but I think it's true. They were in the kitchen, as they often found themselves when there were important things to discuss. She thought later that the kitchen had become their neutral ground, the place where things between them were worked out in the spaces between other things. She was making supper while Abigail did her schoolwork at the table, and Stone had come in from the South Range and taken the standing position near the range that he favored, and they had moved into the conversation the way they often moved into them, sideways through other things. Grayson spoke to Martin Casper today, Stone said. She went still for a moment, then continued with the potatoes. What did he offer? I don't know. Martin didn't say the number. He used the word substantial. And Martin's response, he said he was thinking. She put the knife down and looked at Stone. I know, he said. Martin Casper had 5 children and a wife who was pregnant with the 6th, and a property that had been in his family for 20 years. He was not a man who would sell easily or lightly. But substantial was the word he had used, and substantial meant Grayson was serious about the timeline. We need the cooperative to be real before the pass opens, she said. Not planned, real. Contracts, logistics of first shipment. That's 8 weeks. Can it be done? He looked at her. You're asking me because you've already decided it can. I'm asking you because you know the ranchers and the logistics and the freight rates, and I don't, she said. I can do the organizing on the town side. The ranches I need you for. He was quiet for a moment. Something was happening in his face, not quite decision, but the consolidation that comes before decision. The Hendersons will need their fence line officially acknowledged in writing, he said. That'll cost me a formal survey. I'll pay for it. Good. The millers east of the creek will want a guaranteed minimum volume before they commit. I can backstop that guarantee with the ranch's own production. You do that? It makes sense, he said. If the cooperative fails, the ranch loses a modest guarantee. If the cooperative succeeds, the whole valley benefits. She looked at him. What? He said. Nothing, she said. I'm glad you're the person in this particular situation. Something moved across his face and he looked away, and she went back to the potatoes. I'll ride to the Delacroix place Thursday, he said. I'll have Pruitt send word to the millers, she said. Abigail at the table did not look up from her schoolwork, but she said, You two sound like you're running the territory. We're solving a problem, Jasmine said. That's what running the territory sounds like. Abigail said with the authority of someone who reads a great deal and has arrived at opinions. Ian. Grayson, meanwhile, was doing what Grayson did. He was not aggressive about it, which made it harder to oppose. He moved through the town with a patient, courteous purposefulness, stopping in at the general store, the livery, the church, where Reverend Marsh held diminishing Sunday services. He bought things locally and at fair prices. He was pleasant when he passed people on the street. He sent a donation to the school fund that was large enough to matter and not so large as to seem like a purchase. He also quietly had conversations that Jasmine heard about in pieces through the women at the Thursday sessions and through Roy Morrison and through Gerald Pruitt, who kept his ears open. Grayson had told the Pembertons, who owned the empty bakery building, that he could get them twice what any local buyer would offer. He had told Pete Duvall at the livery that his business model was unsustainable without capital investment and that he could offer a partnership arrangement that would solve the capital problem. He had told 3 families on the east side of town that the creek's water rights were more valuable than they knew and that he was in a position to help them understand what they were really sitting on. None of these conversations were lies. None of them were entirely true either. They were the things a man with capital says to people who need to believe they have options, and the particular cruelty of it was that they were not wrong. Precisely, Grayson could do what he said he could do. The question was what he would do with everything he accumulated once he had it. She asked him one morning at breakfast because she was tired of the circling and because she thought a direct question would be interesting regardless of its answer. What would you do with the town if you owned it, she said. He set down his coffee. He looked at her with the still pale eyes. That's a very direct question. Yes, most people don't ask it directly. I'm not most people. He considered her for a moment. She had the impression of being assessed, not unpleasantly, the assessment of someone who finds competence interesting regardless of its source. The timber west of the creek has commercial value, he said. The land north of the Casper Ranch is suitable for a different kind of cattle operation than what's being done with it now. The water rights are substantial. And the people, he looked at her. The 300 people who live here, she said. The school, the church, the families. What happens to them in your vision? He was quiet for a moment. I'm not a monster, Miss Monroe. I didn't say you were. People would be compensated fairly. They'd have the resources to relocate. To where? To wherever there are opportunities for... To nowhere, she said quietly. There's no town like this one waiting for them. There's no community where they already know each other's names and history and can borrow flour on a Tuesday night. You buy this town and you pay fair prices for the buildings, and each family takes the money and goes somewhere and starts over alone. And what's lost isn't the buildings. What's lost is 30 years of people knowing each other. Grayson looked at her for a long moment. That's a sentimental argument, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is, and it's also true. He picked up his coffee. You're quite unusual, he said. I've been told that before, she said, usually by people who meant it as a way to end the conversation. I meant it as an observation. He looked out the window at the main street where the snow was beginning to come down again slowly, the way a late winter snow comes without commitment, tasting the air. You've been here 2 months, Miss Monroe. You have no property here, no claim. What's your stake in this? She thought about how to answer that. These people, she said finally, let me come to their town and treated me with decency when they had no obligation to. They bought my bread and came to my soup sessions and let me sit with their sick children. Mr. Stone's foreman drove me back and forth in the cold more times than I can count. She looked at her hands around her coffee cup. I came here because a man needed a wife, and it didn't work out, and I was stranded, and the decent thing these people did was treat me like I belonged here. I'm not going to stand by and watch someone take that from them because they don't know there's another option. Grayson was quiet for a moment. The cooperative, he said. She looked at him sharply. I know about it, he said. The freight cooperative that Stone and the ranchers are putting together. He said it without particular emotion, as though he were discussing the weather. It's a good idea. I'm curious whether it will work in time. In time for what? My investors are patient people, he said, but they're not infinitely patient. Then I'll make sure it works in time, she said. She stood and took her cup to the kitchen, and she was aware as she left the room that he was watching her. And she was also aware that he was not precisely hostile, that what he felt about her was something more complicated than that. She did not trust him. She did not think he was a man whose interests aligned with what she cared about. But she thought she understood him, which was different, and she thought that understanding was worth more than outrage. She went to get her coat and go to the school. March came in cold and stayed cold, which was the long-timers in Harlan's Creek said how March usually behaved at this altitude. But the days were lengthening, and the quality of the light was changing, moving from the flat, muffled light of deep winter towards something with more angle to it, more shadow, which was its own kind of promise. The cooperative had a name by then, the Harlan Valley Freight Association. It had 11 member ranches and a provisional contract with the freight company at the Ridgeline Junction, and a guaranteed minimum volume backstopped by Coldwater Ranch. Stone had ridden to every single member ranch personally. He had shaken 11 hands and heard 11 versions of doubt and concern and been honest with all of them, and signed his name to the guarantee without hesitation. Jasmine had written the letters and kept the ledger and organized the first meeting, which had been held in the schoolroom on a Saturday afternoon because it was the only room in town large enough to hold all 11 ranchers and their wives. Henderson and Casper had sat on opposite sides of the room and addressed each other with a formality that acknowledged the fence line settlement without mentioning it. And by the end of the meeting, they had been arguing together about the freight rates in a way that suggested the argument was productive rather than destructive, which was progress. Pete Duvall from the livery had come to that meeting and sat in the back and listened, and afterward he had come to Jasmine and said he was thinking the livery could handle local freight movement, getting goods from the ranches to the Ridgeline Junction if the association was interested. The association was interested. Morrison's General Store now had a line of credit backstopped by the association's freight revenue projections, which Roy had taken to his Denver suppliers, and which had bought him, he said, another 6 months of breathing room. None of this was certain. None of it was finished. It was the skeleton of something that might become solid, and it needed to survive the spring and then the summer and then another winter before anyone could call it a success. But Grayson had been in town for 2 months, and he had not yet made his large offer. He was still at Mrs. Aldicott's boarding house, occupying the north-facing room with studied patience, and he came to breakfast every morning and was courteous and read his newspaper and watched, and what he thought about what he was watching, Jasmine could not entirely tell. One evening in early March, she came in from the school to find him in the parlor with Mrs. Aldicott, and they were improbably playing cards. She stood in the doorway for a moment, coat in hand, and looked at them, the silver-haired innkeeper and the polished investor heads bent over a card game with the focused quiet of people who had, against all probability, found a point of genuine connection. Mrs. Aldicott glanced up. "Don't stand there with the door open," she said. "Come in or go out, one or the other." Jasmine came in. Grayson set down his cards. "Miss Monroe? Mr. Grayson?" Mrs. Aldicott was just explaining the history of this house, he said. "Did you know her late husband built it in 1869? "I did not," Jasmine said. "He was a carpenter," Mrs. Aldicott said, without looking up from her cards. "Best carpenter in 3 counties. This house will stand for 100 years. She played a card with the decisiveness of someone who has been playing cards for 50 years and expects to play for 50 more. "Your deal, Victor." Victor. Jasmine looked at Mrs. Aldicott and then at Grayson and decided she was going to let that settle without comment. Good evening, she said and went upstairs. She lay on her bed that night and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the boarding house. The creak of pipes, the distant snap of the parlor stove. The wind, always the wind. And she thought about what it meant that Estelle Aldicott was calling Victor Grayson by his given name and what that might mean for what came next. She thought too about Stone. She had been thinking about Stone in a particular way for several weeks. Not the generalized way of someone considering a proposal or an arrangement, but the specific way of someone who has spent enough time in proximity to a person to notice the details. The way his hands moved when he was working certain and unhurried. The way he listened with his whole attention, which was a rare thing in the world. The way he talked to Abigail, which was not the way of a man who considers children a separate category of human, but of someone who regarded the child as simply herself, fully requiring the same quality of attention as any adult. She had noticed 3 weeks ago that he had begun to fix the Casper boys' school books without being asked. She had mentioned in passing that Thomas Casper's primer was falling apart, and that his family hadn't the money for a new one. And the next Thursday, Thomas had come to school with a new primer, and looked at her with a face that said he was not entirely sure where it had come from, but that she might know. She had not said anything to Stone about it, but she had stood in the barn the following Saturday next to Threshold's stall while Abigail ran through the grain room on an errand, and she had said quietly, "Thomas Casper has a new primer." And Stone had looked at the horse and said, "He's a smart boy." And she had said, "Yes, he is." And that had been all, and it had been enough. And she had stood in the barn with the warmth of horses around her and felt something settle in herself that had been unsettled for a long time. She was not in love. She did not believe in love that arrived fast, or love that announced itself, or love that behaved like weather. She believed in something slower and more durable, the kind of knowing that accrues the way sediment does layer by layer, building towards something solid that could hold weight. She was building towards something. She thought he was too. It was enough to know that. The storm warning came on the morning of the 15th of March. She heard it first from Pruitt, who had come to town for supplies, and stopped at the boarding house with a face that was serious in a specific way, not the general seriousness of a man who considers life seriously, but the narrow, concentrated seriousness of a man who has lived in the mountains long enough to know when the mountain is planning something. 2 days, he said. Maybe less. The pressure's been dropping since yesterday evening and the horses are restless, and there's a color in the sky this morning that I don't like. She had been in Colorado territory for 3 months by then and had developed a mountain weather instinct that she knew was insufficient, but that she was training. She went outside after Pruitt left and looked at the sky, which was overcast, in a way that was not the ordinary overcast of winter, but the specific dense gray-green overcast that came before certain kinds of storms, the kind that didn't announce themselves with gradual increase, but with a decision. She went back in and told Mrs. Aldicott. Mrs. Aldicott, who had lived in this valley for 30 years, looked at the sky through the kitchen window and said, "Get the cellar stocked." They spent the morning doing exactly that. Jasmine moved flour and preserved goods and lamp oil and firewood from the shed into the house, and Mrs. Aldicott inventoried the water barrels, and by midday the boarding house was as ready as it could be. She sent word to the school Mr. Beaumont should send the children home early. She sent word to Roy Morrison to remind customers about supplies. She sent word to Stone at the ranch through the telegraph, which was working that morning, that the storm was coming and when. His reply was brief. Preparing. Ride out if you need to. Room at the ranch. E.S. She folded the telegraph message and put it in her pocket. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind had started. By 6, it was serious. The storm that came down off the mountains on the night of the 15th of March, 1888, was not the first blizzard Harlan's Creek had endured, and it was not the worst, though it would take time before people were certain of that distinction. What it was, with a precision that could only be understood in retrospect, was the crisis that contained all other crises, the moment in which everything that had been building for months in the town and between people came to its particular head. The first night was frightening without being catastrophic. The wind was very bad, the kind that didn't gust but sustained, that threw itself against the buildings in a constant, exhausting pressure. And the snow fell horizontally, and the temperature dropped to levels that made the air itself seem hostile. Mrs. Aldicott kept the parlor stove at its maximum, and the 5 people in the house herself. Jasmine Holloway, the surveyor, the Pembertons, and somewhat surprisingly, Victor Grayson sat around it in various attitudes of waiting. Grayson was the calmest of them, which surprised her. He had the calm of a man who has learned in the practice of his particular kind of business to regard situations over which he has no control, with the equanimity of someone who conserves his energy for the situations he can affect. He played cards with Holloway and answered Mrs. Aldicott's questions about Denver society with the politely detailed answers of a man who was comfortable discussing anything, and at midnight he went to bed without drama and presumably slept. Jasmine did not sleep. She lay in her room and listened to the storm and thought about the town. She thought about the Winslows east of the main street in the small house that was not as well built as it could be. She thought about the Casper family, Thomas and his siblings, and his mother who was 8 months along in her pregnancy. She thought about old Mrs. Reyes, who lived alone at the south end of the street in a house with a chimney that had been drafting poorly all winter. She thought about the school and the animals in the livery and the horses at Coldwater Ranch, 4 miles away in the dark and the snow. She fell asleep sometime before dawn and woke at first light to a silence so complete it was alarming. The wind had stopped. She dressed quickly and went to the window. The world outside was unrecognizable. The snow was chest-deep in drifts against the buildings, and the main street was a white canyon. Its contours entirely rearranged the boardwalks, buried the hitching posts visible only as dark lines against white. The sky above was the particular blue of extreme cold, cloudless and brilliant and merciless. She pulled on her coat and her heaviest boots and went out. The cold hit her immediately and completely, the kind of cold that made the inside of your nose sting on the first breath and your eyes water on the second. She stood on the boarding house porch and looked up and down the street and assessed. 4 buildings to the south she could see a chimney that was not smoking. Old Mrs. Reyes. She went. The snow was hip-deep between the boarding house and Mrs. Reyes's door, and getting through it was a physical negotiation, lifting her feet high, finding purchase, moving with the deliberate care of someone who knows that falling in snow this deep is an event with consequences. She was breathing hard by the time she reached the door and pounded on it. No answer. She tried the handle. The door opened, not locked, which was right because old women in small towns at this altitude didn't lock their doors. And the cold air inside was the cold air of a space that had not had a fire in hours. And she called out for Mrs. Reyes and heard from upstairs a voice. The chimney had blocked sometime in the night. Mrs. Reyes, 78 years old and sharp-minded, and no fool had pulled every blanket in the house onto the bed and gotten in and stayed put, which was exactly the right decision. But she had been there since 2 in the morning, and she was cold in the deep, bone-cold way of an elderly person who has been cold for too long. Jasmine got the chimney cleared, a matter of a poker and some determination, and a substantial amount of fallen debris, and got the fire going, and got Mrs. Reyes downstairs and into the kitchen, where the heat would come fastest, and she made tea and sat with her until the old woman's color came back, and her hands stopped shaking. "I'm not as young as I used to be," Mrs. Reyes said with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a geological fact. "Nobody is," Jasmine said. "I thought the chimney might sort itself out." She wrapped her hands around the tea. It didn't. Chimneys rarely do. "I've been in worse storms," Mrs. Reyes said. "Not recently, but I have been." "This is a bad one," Jasmine agreed. "We'll need to check on some people." "There's the Winslow children," Mrs. Reyes said immediately. "That east house, the south wall, has gaps I've noticed all winter, and Martin Casper's wife is near her time." "I know," Jasmine said. "I'm going." "Not alone," Mrs. Reyes said. "Don't go alone in this." She found Holloway at the boarding house dressed and already restless with the particular restlessness of a man who is accustomed to active work and hates to be idle. She did not have to explain the situation. She simply told him where she was going and why, and he put on his coat. They went to the Winslows first. Clara Winslow's south wall was, as Mrs. Reyes had said, insufficiently insulated. The family had hung blankets over the gaps, and it had gotten them through the night, but barely. And the 3 children were in bed together for warmth, and Clara was making water as hot as the small stove would give her. Holloway brought firewood from the shed, and Jasmine helped stuff the gaps with strips of wool from a worn blanket, and they got the house to a sustainable temperature before they moved on. Then to the Caspers. Martin Casper had the situation under control in the practical sense. The house was warm, his older children were fed, the outbuilding animals were attended to, but he met them at the door with a face that told her everything she needed to know about his wife. "She started in the night," he said quietly so the older children wouldn't hear. "How far along?" "I don't know." He was a rancher, a large, capable man, and he looked at Jasmine with the particular helplessness of competence encountering something outside its domain. "I don't know enough about these things." Get the doctor, Holloway said. Doc Hennessy lives across town in the drifts. I'll go, Holloway said. He went. He was a large man and strong, and he broke a path through the snow with the focused energy of a man who has decided to do a thing and is doing it, and Jasmine went inside to Martha Casper. Martha was 32 and had done this 4 times before, and greeted Jasmine with the combination of pain and pragmatic relief of someone who has been hoping for company but hasn't wanted to ask. Jasmine took off her coat, washed her hands with the hot water Martin was keeping ready, and assessed. Everything was proceeding normally. The baby was not in any particular hurry, and the birth, when it eventually arrived sometime after noon, was uncomplicated. The fifth Casper child making its entrance with the composed practicality of someone who has been planned for which, in the circumstances, it had not been. But it turned out that babies don't distinguish. Doc Hennessy arrived 20 minutes later, breathing hard from the walk through the snow, and looked at the mother and child and at Jasmine and said, "You didn't need me." "We might have," she said. "I'm glad you came." The baby was a girl. Martha Casper named her immediately before anyone else could suggest anything, Anne, after her own mother. The older Casper children were brought in to see Thomas among them, with his new primer and his wide-set eyes and his face. When he looked at his new sister was the specific face of a 10-year-old boy encountering something he doesn't have words for yet, which is possibly the clearest proof of the existence of wonder. She was back at Mrs. Aldicott's by 3 in the afternoon, tired in the thorough way of someone who has been moving and working for 8 hours in difficult conditions, and she had barely gotten through the door when Pruitt's boy appeared at the end of the street. Pruitt kept a son of 14 in town during the winters for exactly the kind of errand. This turned out to be a message from the ranch delivered at a run through the snow. The boy's face red with cold and exertion. The message was this: there were children from the Hendersons' place trapped in the old mine building 3/4 of a mile north of town. They had been there since last night. They were known to be alive. Henderson had found tracks before the second snow began, but the drifts between the town and the mine were impassable for a standard wagon, and the mine building was not insulated, and the children, 4 of them, ages 7 to 12, had been sheltering in the deepest rooms since midnight. Stone was already on his way from the ranch. The message was asking Jasmine to assemble anyone in town who could help and to bring blankets and what she had for warming people quickly. She went back out.
Nash?
They met at the north end of the main street herself, in Holloway and Pete Duvall from the livery, and Roy Morrison and Martin Casper's older brother Frank, who had appeared at some point in the previous hour and had the quality of a man who shows up when things need doing and doesn't explain how he knew. Mrs. Aldicott had packed a bag of what Jasmine needed, the warming things, the honey ginger preparation extra blankets, and had done it before being asked because Mrs. Aldicott had been in this valley for 30 years and knew what cold children needed. Grayson had appeared at the boarding house door as Jasmine was leaving. She had looked at him. "I can be useful," he said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact delivered without self-justification. She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Come then." Stone arrived from the north on horseback at the same moment the town group arrived at the north end of the street, and there was a moment of reckoning between horse and snow that the horse won, and Stone came down off the animal in one motion and looked at the assembled group with the rapid, practical assessment of someone who is accounted competent in emergencies and knows it. His gaze went to Jasmine and stayed for a moment. "Henderson's boy came to the ranch this morning," he said. "He'd gotten through the back way over the ridge. The other 4 are in the deep room. There's a stove in there and enough wood for another few hours." "How deep are the drifts on the north road?" Frank Casper asked. "Chest deep in the worst sections. We'll need to break trail." "How many hands can you spare?" Duvall asked. "2 from the ranch," Stone said, "plus the 6 of you." Grayson stepped forward slightly. 8, he said. Stone looked at him, a quick, considering look that was not unfriendly. 8, he said. They went north. The 2 hours that followed were the hardest physical work Jasmine had done in her life, which was saying something because she had worked hard for many years. Breaking trail through chest-deep snow and mountain cold, with no certainty of what you were going to find at the end of it, is a particular experience. The way time narrows down to the immediate, the next step, the next breath. The way the cold stops being a backdrop and becomes the actual matter you are working against. She was in the middle of the group not because anyone had placed her there, but because her legs were shorter and the trail broken by Stone and Frank Casper ahead of her was the best surface available. And behind her, Holloway and Grayson and Pete Duvall closed the trail against the drifting that the wind was doing to their work. They were warm from the inside the way working people are, the particular warmth of exertion in extreme cold that is its own weather system. Stone moved with the quality of a man who has broken trail in difficult conditions, before which she knew he had the cavalry experience showed, in the way he managed his body, conserving what could be conserved, expending what needed to be expended with no waste. He turned twice to check the group behind him, and both times his eyes found her specifically, and she nodded to tell him she was all right, and he turned back and kept going. 3/4 of a mile takes a very long time when you are breaking trail through chest-deep snow. When they reached the mine building, a substantial structure, timber frame built, when the mine had been operating and money had been available. Stone went to the deep room door and opened it, and the smell of cramped, close, cold air came out, and then from inside came the sound of 4 children who had been frightened and cold for many hours, suddenly understanding that the frightened and cold part was ending. They were all right. They were cold and hungry, and the youngest, a girl of 7, had cried so much she had exhausted herself into sleep somewhere around midnight and had been kept awake since by her older brother, a boy of 10 named Reuben Henderson, who had by all accounts done everything right, kept the stove going, kept his sisters and his cousin together rationed. The wood talked to them, kept them from panicking. Stone crouched down in front of Reuben Henderson and looked at the boy for a moment. "You did well," he said. The boy's face did something complicated. He was 10 years old, and he had been responsible for 3 other children for 15 hours in a snowstorm. And he had done it, and now that it was done, his face was deciding whether it was allowed to fall apart. Stone put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did exactly right," he said. "Your father is on his way." The face held together, barely. Jasmine was already with the youngest girl, warming the small, cold hands between her own and Grayson. She noticed this had taken off his coat and wrapped it around the second oldest child, a girl of 9, who was shivering hard without being asked and without commenting on it. They got the children warmed enough to move, and they moved them back down the trail, which was faster because it was already broken, and they got back to town before full dark, which was barely. Henderson arrived from the east as they came through the north end of the street, and the reunion between father and children was swift and not public the way things are between people who are not demonstrative and who feel things deeply. And Jasmine did not look at it directly because it was not hers to look at. She looked instead at Stone, who was standing at the edge of the scene with the particular stillness. He sometimes had the stillness of someone who is very aware of being nearby, something that touches something old and very particular in him. She went to stand beside him. He did not look at her. He was watching the Hendersons. "Reuben," he said after a moment. "That boy. 10 years old," she said. "He kept them alive." "Yes, that's who these children are," she said. "The ones who grow up in places like this." He looked at her then, and in his face was something that she had not seen there before. Not the careful guardedness that was his habitual register, not the compressed quality of a man who has learned to contain himself. Something that was closer to open the way a window is open, the way light moves through glass. "Come to the ranch tonight," he said. "It's getting dark and the road back is clear enough now. Abigail will—" He stopped, started again. "I don't want you here alone in this." She looked at the dark coming down over the town, the pale blue going purple at the horizon, the temperature dropping again with the loss of the sun. "All right," she said. They rode back through the dark Stone on horseback and Jasmine on the wagon with Pruitt, and the stars were coming out above the mountains with the astonishing clarity that comes after heavy weather in high places, hard and brilliant, the way things are when the air has been scrubbed clean. She had been to the ranch many times by then. She knew the kitchen, the parlor, the particular creak of the third stair from the top. She knew which burners on the range ran hot and which ran moderate, and she knew where the good pots were, and she knew that Abigail kept a book under her mattress because she read past her bedtime and thought no one knew. But coming in out of the cold that night after the day that it had been was different. Abigail met them at the door and looked at Jasmine with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone who has spent time worrying, and then with the naturalness of a child who has decided something without deliberating about it, put her arms around Jasmine and held on. Jasmine held the child for a moment. Abigail's arms were thin and wiry and very certain. "The Henderson children are safe," Jasmine said. "Pruitt's boy told me," Abigail said. She pulled back and looked at her uncle. "You look terrible." "Thank you, Abigail." "Are you hurt?" "No. Your hands look—" "They're fine." Jasmine looked at his hands and then at him. He shook his head fractionally, meaning nothing serious. She took it for now and followed Abigail inside. Supper was whatever she could put together from the ranch kitchen, which was quite a lot. She had learned the pantry and what was in it, and she made a soup that was more stock and vegetable than anything else. But that was hot and substantial, and that they ate at the kitchen table without much conversation. The comfortable silence of people who have done something hard together and are allowing the body to recover. After supper, Abigail went up to bed. She went without being asked, which was either exhaustion or tactfulness, and Jasmine suspected some of both. Stone remained at the table. He had washed up after supper, and his face was tired in the way of someone who has been managing things for a long time and has temporarily stopped. He was looking at the lamp in the center of the table at the particular quality of the light it made, and he had the look of a man who is deciding whether to say something. She poured the last of the coffee and brought it to the table and sat across from him. He picked up the cup and put it down again. "I spent 7 years not trusting this," he said. She waited. Not the ranch, not the work." He looked at his hands. "This, a kitchen table, people, what it feels like when there's someone." He stopped. "I spent 7 years convincing myself I didn't want it, that I was fine." "Were you?" "I kept the ranch running," he said. "I kept Abigail fed and schooled and as loved as I know how. I fixed fences. I attended things I was asked to attend. I was functional." He paused. "But that's not the same thing." "No," she said. "Margaret died because I was away," he said. It was the first time he had said her name directly to Jasmine, and the directness of it was its own kind of courage. "A January storm 4 years after Abigail came to us. She went to check on the horses. There was a mare about to foal. She was worried, and she took the child with her, the boy." He paused. He was 7 months old. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. "They found her the next morning," he said. 20 feet from the barn. She'd gotten turned around in the dark in the snow. The boy—" He stopped. He was in her coat. She had him tucked inside her coat. The lamp made its small sound on the table between them. "I have spent years," he said, "surviving. I have been very good at surviving." He looked at her. "I forgot how to live." She was quiet for a long moment. The house around them was still the way mountain houses are still after storms. The particular silence of a world that has expended itself and is resting. "That's the most terrifying thing you could have said," she said, "and also the most honest." He looked at her. "Most people never say it," she said. "They just keep surviving and call it living and eventually can't tell the difference." "Can you," he said, "tell the difference?" She thought about her mother, about the years of tending and the love that had been in the tending, and also the way she had sometimes in the deepest part of the night felt a grief so particular it had no name. Not for her mother's suffering, but for her own smallness, her own confinement. The way a life of pure service can consume the liver of it until there is very little left that is yours. "I'm learning to," she said. "I thought I knew who I was when I got on that train. I thought I was a woman who was capable and reliable and who could make something workable out of an arranged marriage in a difficult place. And I was right about the capable part and the reliable part, and—" She looked at the lamp. "But I wasn't right about what I wanted. I wanted—" She stopped. "What?" "This," she said. "Not this kitchen specifically. Not you specifically, not at first." She looked at him. "But something that felt like this. Something that was mine and required me fully, and that I chose." He was very quiet. "I didn't choose Cincinnati," she said. "I was born there. I didn't choose my mother being sick or needing me for 4 years, or what that did to the years I had between 18 and 25. I didn't choose the boarding house in Cincinnati where the women looked at me and saw—" She stopped. "I chose the train. That was the first thing that was entirely mine." "You chose this badly," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, dry, quiet, self-aware, that was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him, and it was so unexpected that she looked at him sharply, and he was looking at the table with something in his expression that was unmistakably a suppressed version of something lighter than his usual register. "The arrangement was badly managed," she said with the same quality. "The result is under negotiation." He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was different from his daytime face. Or perhaps she was seeing it differently after the day that it had been after the conversation they had just had. The compression was still there, the quality of a man who had contained himself for years, but there was also something that was not quite gone, but was loosening the way a fist loosens finger by finger when the thing it was holding against is gone. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was a large hand and warm, and it settled over her hand with a certainty that was the opposite of urgency, not claiming, not hesitant, but there the way a decision that has been made carefully is there. She looked at their hands on the table. Slowly, she said, "Yes," he said. She turned her hand under his until they were palm to palm, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen of Coldwater Ranch, while the night held its mountain silence around them, and outside the stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent beauty, and the horses shifted in the barn below, and a child slept upstairs in a brass bed, and the lamp on the table made its small, steady light. Later, she would not be precise about how much. Later, he leaned across the table and she leaned toward him, and he kissed her with the careful, certain quality of a man who has wanted to do something for a long time and is finally doing it right. It lasted only a moment, a point of contact warm and quiet with the whole weight of the preceding months behind it, and the particular quality of something that is not a beginning but a confirmation. He pulled back. She looked at him. Slowly, he said again. "Yes," she agreed. She slept in the guest room that night, the practical arrangement and the right one, and she lay in the dark for a while listening to the night wind and the particular breathing of a sleeping house. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she had not entirely known she was missing until it returned. She felt precisely located. In the morning, Grayson made his move. Not Grayson directly, he was still at Mrs. Aldicott's boarding house, presumably eating breakfast with his usual courteous patience. But his lawyers who had arrived on the coach from Denver the week before, and who had been quietly making their own conversations, sent letters to every property owner in Harlan's Creek on the morning of the 16th of March, the day after the storm. The letters were precise and professionally worded. They made an offer of purchase for each property with a price that was, as Jasmine learned, making her way back to town through the cleared Main Street, talking to Roy Morrison, and then to the Caspers, and then to Pete Duvall significant. Not overwhelming, not the number that made people afraid to ask questions, but the number that made people think. The letters also contained a deadline 30 days. She stood in Morrison's general store with the letter in her hand and looked at Roy. "He timed it," Roy said. "He had the particular flatness of a man who respects a chess move even when it's being made against him. Storm comes through, everyone's shaken up. We all just spent a day being reminded how dangerous this place can be. And then the morning after, here's an offer." "He's not wrong about the timing," Jasmine said. "No." Roy looked at his store, the shelves, the floor he had swept for 20 years, the counter his father had built. "He's very good at this." She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "The cooperative," she said. "Where does the first shipment stand?" "Ready," Roy said. "Duval has the freight wagons prepped. Henderson's already got his beef sorted and counted. We were waiting for the pass to open." "When does the pass open?" "Another week, maybe less after this last storm. The question is—" He looked at his hands on the counter. "Whether enough people are still here to run it." "We need to talk to everyone," she said, "before anyone responds to those letters." "When?" "Tonight," she said. She found Stone on the main street. He had ridden in after her, and he had seen the letters. Henderson had stopped him on the North Road with a copy, and he had the look of a man who is very controlled about something he is angry about. "He planned this," Stone said. "Yes." She was walking, and he was beside her, the horse on his other side. "But being well planned doesn't make it the right outcome." "The letters go to everyone," Stone said, "including people who were almost convinced to stay." "I know. If even 4 or 5 families sell, the cooperative loses critical mass." "I know." He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "Meeting tonight," she said. "In the schoolroom, every family in town." "You can't compel people to choose this place," he said. It was not an argument against her idea. It was a statement of something he had been living with for a long time, something that cost him. "No," she said. "I can't, and neither can you." She stopped walking and looked at him. "But we can make sure they're choosing with full information. Not just Grayson's offer and the storm they're still scared from, but all of it, the cooperative, the school improvements, what we've been building. Let them choose with the whole picture." He looked at her for a long moment. The main street of Harlan's Creek was quiet around them, the cleaned-up post-storm quiet of a place that has been through something and is taking stock. The sun was out, and the snow sparkled with the aggressive brightness of mountain snow in direct sun, and the air smelled of cold pine and wood smoke and the particular clean smell that follows bad weather. "I'll go to the ranches," he said. "I'll do the town," she said. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he nodded and put his foot in the stirrup and was up and gone north, the horse moving well in the clear-packed snow. She turned south and went to Mrs. Aldicott's to find Grayson. He was in the parlor by the stove with a book. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him without being invited. "You didn't have to time it like that," she said. "Good morning, Miss Monroe." The day after the storm, she said, when people are still frightened. People make their best decisions when they understand the risks clearly, he said. A storm clarifies that. Or it inflates it. He looked at her. They live with real risk here. That's not my invention. No, she said, but you're using it. He was quiet for a moment. What would you have me do, he said. This is business. I have investors. I have obligations. I can't. He stopped. You could give us 30 more days, she said. Not 30 days from the letters, 60. Why? Because in 60 days, the cooperative will have run its first shipment. The school will have a second teacher. The water situation on the east side will have been addressed. She leaned forward slightly. You can still make your offer at 60 days, Mr. Grayson. But at 60 days, the people who receive it will be choosing between your offer and something real, not between your offer and hope. He looked at her for a long time. Mrs. Aldicott, he said, and then stopped. She waited. Mrs. Aldicott told me, he said carefully, that when her husband built this house, the town was about 40 people. She said in 10 years, it grew to nearly 400. He paused. She said the thing that grew it was not money primarily. It was, she used the word, intention. He looked at his book. That people chose to stay and build, and that the choosing changed the place. She would know, Jasmine said. She would. He was quiet for a moment. I will give you 60 days, he said, and I want it understood that I am not doing so because I have been convinced that my business interests have changed. I'm doing so because... He paused again, the pause of a man who is being more honest than he originally planned, because the argument about the 30 years of people knowing each other's names was not entirely dismissible. She looked at him. I have made a great deal of money, he said, by being honest about what things are worth. I am attempting to be equally honest in this instance. I appreciate that, she said. Don't appreciate it too much, he said. I am still Victor Grayson. At 60 days, I will still make my offer. Understood, she said. She stood. Will you come to the meeting tonight? He looked at her. Why? Because you should see what you're deciding about, she said. Not just the land and the water rights, the people. He was quiet for a very long time. Yes, he said finally, I'll come. Damn! They filled the schoolroom to capacity that night. Not just the families of the town, the ranch hands came in from the nearby places, and the Hendersons with all 6 of their children, Reuben at his father's side, with the particular gravity of a boy who has recently discovered what he is capable of. Martha Casper was there with the new baby in her arms, and Thomas at her side leaning slightly against her. Mrs. Reyes came on the arm of Pete Duvall, which suggested an arrangement Jasmine had not known about. Mrs. Aldicott stood at the back with her arms folded and an expression of someone who has seen towns decide their own fates before and is prepared to witness another. Grayson was there too, standing near the door with his hands in his coat pockets and his pale eyes moving around the room with the comprehensive attention of a man who is, whatever else he is paying attention. Stone stood at the front of the room. Jasmine had suggested he speak. He had suggested she speak. They had briefly considered speaking together and had decided that would be overcomplicating something that should be simple. He spoke. He was not an orator. He did not have the trained cadences of a man who gave speeches, but he was a man who believed what he was saying, which was better. He told them what the cooperative would do. He told them the numbers, the freight cost per family, the projected revenue, the first shipment date. He told them what it would cost to keep the school staffed and what the Beaumont family needed and what it would cost to fix the east side water situation. He told them what the town would look like in 5 years if the cooperative succeeded and what it would look like in 5 years if it failed or if families began to leave. He did not tell them what to do. You've had letters today, he said. That's a real offer. It comes from a real man who is not without his own kind of integrity, whatever his interests are. He did not look at Grayson when he said this. He was looking at the room. You have 30 days, 60 days as I understand it to make a decision. He paused. What I'm telling you tonight is what you'd be deciding to stay for. Whether it's enough is something only you can say. He sat down. There was a silence. Then Reuben Henderson stood up. He was 10 years old and he had the look of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. I want to stay, he said. He said it to the room, not to his father, not to Stone, to the assembled people of Harlan's Creek. I know it's hard. I know last night was... He stopped, and in the stopping was everything the night had been. But I want to stay. He sat down. His father beside him put a hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Clara Winslow said from the second row, I want to stay. And then other voices, not all at once. Not in a chorus. This was not a room full of people performing unanimity. Some voices were hesitant, some were clear, some were quiet. But by the end, when Jasmine was keeping the informal count in her head, the room was more than three-quarters for staying. She looked at Grayson near the door. He was looking at the Henderson boy. She could not read his face entirely, but there was something in it that was different from what it had been in the morning. Assam. The cooperative ran its first shipment on the 30th of March, 12 days after the storm, 5 days after the pass opened. The first shipment was nothing dramatic: beef from 4 ranches, some stored grain, a quantity of wool from the Delacroix place that had been waiting for transport since October. Pete Duvall's freight wagons made the run south to the Ridgeline Junction and came back with supplies at prices that were, by Jasmine's careful accounting, 23% below what those same families had been paying before. Roy Morrison put the numbers up in the window of his store. People stood outside and read them. Thomas Casper, on his way to school, stopped and read the numbers with the focused attention of a boy who is good at mathematics and is currently applying mathematics to something real. "That's a lot less," he told his schoolmate, a girl named Priscilla Duvall. "My father says it changes things," Priscilla said. "Your father's right," Thomas said, and went into school. On the 28th day of Grayson's 60-day deadline, Grayson came to the school. He came on a weekday morning when Jasmine was working with the younger children on their letters, and he sat in the back of the room for the last 40 minutes of the morning session without saying anything. The children were aware of him in the way children are aware of unfamiliar adults. The peripheral attention, the checking glances, but the letters needed writing. And he was quiet, and Jasmine managed the room as she always did, and when the session ended and the children filed out, she stayed. He was still there. "Mr. Grayson," she said. "Miss Monroe." He looked around the room, the slates, the small desks, the window at the south that let in the afternoon light. "My mother was a school teacher." She looked at him. "In Ohio," he said. "A very small school, 30 years ago." He paused. "She did what you're doing. She taught whoever came in, whatever they needed." He was quiet for a moment. "I went to better schools than hers. I told myself that was progress." "Maybe it was," Jasmine said. "Maybe," he said. He stood. "I'm withdrawing my offer, for now." She said nothing. The cooperative changes the mathematics sufficiently that a different kind of development is possible, he said, and she recognized this as his way of explaining himself in terms he could live with. "There may be a conversation at some point about the timber rights or the water claims, but that's a different conversation for a different time. With the property owners," she said, "not around them." "Yes." He picked up his hat. "You should know that I don't intend to disappear from this territory. I'll be back." "I expect you will," she said. He put his hat on. At the door he paused, and she thought that there was something in the habit of pausing at doors, something that people did when there was one more thing. When leaving required one more accounting. "You've done something here," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the door. "I'm not sure what to call it." "I helped with some practical problems," she said. "Yes," he said, and then quietly, "Good afternoon, Miss Monroe." He went out. She stood in the empty classroom for a long moment in the afternoon light, with the smell of chalk and small children, and the particular warmth of a room that has been full of learning, and she felt something that she had been holding without quite knowing. She was holding it ease its grip. Spring came to Harlan's Creek the way it always came to high places. Not with the sudden generous warmth of the lower country, but carefully, incrementally, the way trust is rebuilt after it has been damaged. There were days in April that were still hard with late-season snow and a cold that reminded everyone this altitude did not yield easily. But between those days were mornings of startling brightness, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes and the creek running with snowmelt, and the particular smell of mountain spring, which is mud and pine and water, and possibility in a combination that is different from the smell of any other season. Jasmine was teaching full mornings in the school by April, not as an assistant to Beaumont, but as his partner. They had worked out a division of the students by age and need that allowed Beaumont to do what he was actually good at, which was the older students in the advanced mathematics, while she handled the younger children in the reading. The school board, which consisted of 3 men who had been uncertain about the arrangement in December, had formalized it in March after the town meeting with a salary that was modest but honest. She was technically staying. She had not made a formal announcement of this to anyone. She had simply stopped talking about leaving, and the town had adjusted around this, without comment, the way communities adjust when they have decided collectively to include someone. Mrs. Aldicott had said one evening in April, I assume you'll be wanting to sublet eventually, when things are settled. Eventually, Jasmine had said. There's no rush. There isn't, Mrs. Aldicott had agreed. But just so you know, the Pemberton room will be available come summer. Bigger. It was its own kind of invitation. The days between her and Stone had a particular quality by spring, a quality she recognized as the feeling of something that has been going slowly and is now without anyone having changed the pace exactly simply further along than it was. He came to town twice a week now, which was more than practical necessity required, and the visits had a shape to them. Supplies or business in the morning, the school in the afternoon when she was done, and then supper somewhere, sometimes at Mrs. Aldicott's, sometimes at the Morrisons', sometimes increasingly simply walking in the long spring evenings while the light lasted and the creek ran and the air was the best thing about the world. They talked about many things, about the cooperative which was proving out, about the second freight run and the third, about the Henderson fence officially surveyed and recorded the Hendersons legally right, Casper legally wrong, and both families now cooperating on the freight run with the businesslike comfort of people who have settled an old score and moved past it. About Abigail, who had begun Threshold's proper training and was showing a patience with it that Stone regarded with open pride and some wonder. They talked about Margaret sometimes, not often and not as something that needed to be worked through or resolved, but the way people talk about someone who has been important, the small specific things, the things that were true. He told her Margaret had been a better rider than anyone he knew. She had grown up on horses in Virginia and ridden with the ease of someone to whom it was simply an extension of herself. He told her that Margaret had had a singing voice, which Abigail had inherited, though Abigail claimed otherwise. He told her that Margaret had argued with him about fence lines with the same stubborn precision that Martin Casper brought to his own fence arguments, and that he had loved her for it. Jasmine listened. She asked questions when she had them and kept quiet when she didn't. She understood, without this having to be explained, that the listening was not only about Margaret, it was about Stone learning after years of compression to let things out, to find that the ground did not fall away when he said a thing aloud, that the words did not unmake what they described. She told him about her mother, about the 4 years and the specific difficulty of loving someone whose decline required you to contain your own needs because theirs were so immediate and real. About the particular loneliness of that containment, which was not resentment. She had not resented her mother, but was its own kind of grief. The grief of a life held in suspension while another life ran its course. Did you ever wish, he stopped himself, that she would die sooner? She said it simply. Yes, and then felt terrible about it, and then understood that the wish was not for her death, but for the end of her suffering, and that those are different things even if they require the same event. He was quiet for a moment. You're very exact about feelings. My mother was exact about things, she said. She was very particular about language. She said the wrong word was a door to the wrong room. He thought about this. What's the right word for what we're doing? She looked at him. They were walking along the creek in the golden late afternoon light of early May, the water loud and cold beside them, and the aspens just beginning to show their first pale leaves. Building, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then that's right. She stopped walking and turned toward him, and he turned toward her with the attentiveness that was simply how he was, the whole attention, no division. She had thought sometimes about whether she felt what she was supposed to feel, whether there was supposed to be more of something, more drama or heat, or the consuming quality that she had read about in the novels her mother had kept on the shelf. And she had decided that what she felt was not the absence of those things, but simply not those things. What she felt was certain, what she felt was located. What she felt was that, when she thought about what came next, he was in it, and that felt like the most honest thing she had ever known about herself. She also felt with an exactness she would have appreciated that his hand was warm, where it had found hers there beside the creek in the Maylight, and that this was the right thing, and that they had taken the time it required, and that this was the reason it was the right thing. I want to stay, she said. He looked at her. Not just for the school, she said. Not just for the cooperative, or the Winslows or Mrs. Reyes, she paused, for the specifics, the particular specifics. He looked at her for a long moment. Will you, he said. Yes, she said, if you'll have me. He brought her hand up, her hand that was in his, and held it and looked at it for a moment and then at her. I'll have you, he said. It was the simplest sentence in the world and the most particular one he had ever said, and she understood it that way. They stood by the creek while the water ran its cold spring course, and the aspens made their small sound in the light wind, and the mountains above them held their perpetual indifference toward human arrangements, which was, she thought, a useful backdrop for any life worth building. The reminder that the mountains did not care, which meant that what was built by people, which was the only way anything that mattered ever got built. In May, Abigail began teaching Jasmine to ride properly. This was Abigail's idea, offered with the tactical straightforwardness of a child who has identified a gap and seen a solution. Jasmine could ride adequately in the way of someone who has taken it up as an adult and learned the necessary mechanics. But adequately was not the same as well, and Abigail, who was becoming well, had opinions about the gap. "You're stiff in your hips," Abigail said from Threshold's back, watching Jasmine circle the paddock on the bay gelding. "You need to let them move with the horse instead of staying ahead of it." "I'm aware," Jasmine said. "And you're holding the reins too tight. He's asking you something and you're not letting him." "What is he asking?" "Whether you trust him." Abigail said this with the authority of someone who had worked this out personally over many sessions with Threshold and had found it to be true. Horses ask that constantly. You have to keep answering yes. Stone was watching from the fence rail. He had the expression he had when Abigail was being particularly herself, the compound expression that was something like pride and something like wonder and something like the specific amusement of a man who has spent 11 years watching a child develop opinions and is still sometimes surprised by what they become. "Tell your uncle," Jasmine said without looking at him, "that I am paying attention." "She says she's paying attention," Abigail relayed unnecessarily. "I heard," Stone said. "Then stop looking at me like that," Jasmine said, "and come tell me what you see from the rail." He came off the fence and into the paddock and stood in the center while she circled, and he told her what he saw, which was nearly identical to what Abigail had said, but delivered in slightly different terms, and she adjusted and adjusted again. And on the fourth circuit, something shifted, the hips unlocked, the hands softened, and the bay gelding, who had been asking the question for 20 minutes, got his answer, and lengthened his stride and moved differently, better, with a fluency that went up through Jasmine's body like something being recognized. "There," Stone said. She kept going, feeling it, the difference between managing a horse and being with one. It was a larger difference than she had thought. "It's the same as everything," she said on the next pass. "What is?" "The trusting," she said. "You have to actually do it. You can't pretend to do it and get the same result." He was quiet for a moment, watching her circle. "No," he said. "You can't." She looked at him as she passed. His face was doing the thing that had been doing increasingly, the open thing, the window thing. She was getting very good at reading it. She thought, yes, that is the actual man. They were married in June in Reverend Marsh's church, which was fuller than it had been for any service in 2 years. It was not a dramatic wedding. Jasmine had not wanted dramatic, and Stone had not wanted dramatic, and they had agreed on simple, with the efficiency of two people who agree on most things when they apply themselves to it. She wore the good dress she had brought from Cincinnati, the cream-colored wool, which she had thought, leaving Cincinnati, that she might someday need, and had brought on instinct in someone she suspected, Mrs. Aldicott, but never confirmed it, had put flowers at the front of the church. Mountain flowers, the early summer kind, with the bright specificity of color that high-altitude flowers have, as though the altitude requires maximum effort from everything that grows there. Abigail was beside Jasmine. She had asked to be with the directness of a child who knows what she wants and does not see the point of not asking for it. She stood through the ceremony with her back very straight and the particular expression of someone performing a dignified duty with appropriate gravity, and when Reverend Marsh said what needed to be said, and Stone said what needed to be said, and Jasmine said what needed to be said, Abigail's expression shifted briefly, privately, the way a thing that has been contained will sometimes move when you aren't managing it, into something that was simply happiness. After the ceremony, in the yard outside the church, where the June day had done its best and produced warmth and clear sky and the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look like it has been slightly improved, someone produced a fiddle. The fiddler was one of the Delacroix hands, a man named Beauchamp, who played with the ease of someone who has been playing since he was old enough to hold the bow, and what he played was not stately or formal, but the particular kind of dance music that belongs to people who work with their hands and take their pleasures seriously when they have them. People danced. Jasmine danced once with Stone, who was not a particularly graceful dancer, but was a certain one which was characteristic of him, and who held her with the same quality of presence he brought to everything. And she was aware, dancing, of the particular quality of the afternoon, The specific weight and light of it, the sound of the music and the sound of children running on the grass, and the sound of conversation from the people who were not dancing. And she thought, this is the thing. This is the thing that cannot be purchased or consolidated or developed. This is the thing Grayson could not have bought if he had bought every building on the street and every water right along the creek and every acre of timber to the west. The fiddle played and the afternoon held its light, and Harlan's Creek, Colorado territory on a June afternoon in 1888 was a place where people knew each other's names. The wedding gift that surprised her most was from Victor Grayson. It came by post 3 days after the wedding, addressed to Mrs. Stone. She answered to Mrs. Stone. She had discovered she answered to it quite naturally, and it was a set of books. 6 of them in good bindings, with a card that said simply, "For the school library." VG. They were good books. 2 histories of the Colorado territory, one of which was thorough enough to be genuinely useful to the older students. An arithmetic textbook more current than what Beaumont had. 2 novels, both respectable and interesting. And she held this one for a moment when she found it a natural history of mountain plants organized by region with careful illustrations and descriptions of uses including medicinal. She brought it to the school on Monday and showed it to Beaumont. "From Grayson," she said. Beaumont looked at the book and then at her. He searched for the right word. "Complicated. Most things are," she said. She wrote Grayson a brief note of thanks on behalf of the school, and in the note she said that the natural history book in particular was going to be used more than he probably knew. She left it at that. His reply came 3 weeks later. "I expect you're the one who will use it most. That seems appropriate." In midsummer, the Henderson fence was celebrated. Not formally. What happened was that Peter Henderson, on the occasion of the first combined fence riding that the cooperative had organized, a practical matter of checking the range boundaries before the late summer cattle movement, threw the post-riding supper at his own place and invited every family involved in the cooperative and hosted the evening with the particular hospitality of a man who has been right about something for 11 years and can now afford to be generous about it. The Caspers came. Martin Casper brought a bottle of whiskey, which was both a conciliatory gesture and an accurate assessment of what Henderson would appreciate, and Henderson accepted it with the straight-faced pleasure of a man who knows exactly what the gesture means and chooses to take only the surface of it. They ate outside in the Henderson yard at tables made of boards and sawhorses, and the evening was one of those summer evenings that the mountains produce in midsummer. Long, light, warm, with the smell of hay and the far sound of the creek, and the mountains visible above the tree line in a gold and purple combination that the light did to them in late evening. Children ran in and out of the barn, and the adults talked, and the whiskey went around, and someone at some point produced a harmonica, which was not as good as the fiddle, but which was adequate, and several people danced on the flat dirt of the yard. Jasmine sat with Clara Winslow and watched. Clara's youngest was walking now, the determined, uncertain walking of a child who has just discovered that upright locomotion is possible and intends to make enthusiastic use of it. She tracked across the yard in whatever direction caught her attention, with Clara following at a step's distance. Reddy and Jasmine watched them and thought about the particular combination of attention and freedom that parenting required, the constant readiness alongside the deliberate release. "You're thinking hard," Clara said. "I do that." "Stone's watching you," Clara said. Jasmine looked across the yard. Stone was in conversation with Henderson, but Clara was right. Some portion of his attention was angled toward her, the particular attention she knew now to recognize. "He does that," Jasmine said. Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who has been watching 2 people arrive at each other for months. "Are you happy?" she said. Clara was not a woman who asked indirect questions. Jasmine thought about it, which was the only respectful response to an honest question. "Yes," she said. "In the specific sense. I'm happy about the specific things I have." "That's the right kind," Clara said. "I know. The unspecific kind, happiness, as though it's a weather condition that one comes and goes and you can't build on it." Clara shifted her daughter onto her hip. "The specific kind, that's the one that holds." "Your mother told you that," Jasmine said. "I told myself that," Clara said, "in about year 3 of the South Wall situation." Jasmine looked at her. "The wall is fixed now." "Yes, it is," Clara said with a satisfaction so complete it required no addition. In August, Abigail decided she wanted to learn to bake. This was announced at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the same directness she brought to all of her decisions. She had been watching Jasmine bake for months, she said, and she understood the general shape of it and she wanted to understand the specific shapes. All right, Jasmine said, we start with bread. Why bread first? Because bread teaches you everything. Temperature, timing, the feel of dough when it's right, the smell of yeast doing its work. If you understand bread, you understand baking. Abigail got an apron, which was one of Jasmine's, that reached her ankles, and she tied it up with the practical competence of a girl who has been managing her own clothing since she was 6. Stone, who had come in from the barn for coffee, looked at this arrangement with an expression that he managed to keep neutral. You're not going to say anything, Jasmine said. About what, he said. About your niece wearing my apron in my kitchen learning to bake. He poured his coffee. It seems like an efficient use of a Saturday morning, he said. Good. There are worse things she could be learning. Considerably worse, Jasmine agreed. Abigail, measuring flour with the focus of a scientist, said, You two are very strange. Thank you, they said more or less simultaneously. Abigail looked up. Something moved across her face, not surprise, but its outcome, the settlement that follows surprise when what has happened is good. She went back to her flour. The bread came out well, not perfectly. The first loaf was slightly dense, which Jasmine explained was a yeast timing issue, and the second was better. And by the third loaf, Abigail had the feel of the dough and was working it with the particular intuition that some people have for baking. The same intuition they have for horses or mathematics or the natural world, the thing that is not learned but recognized. Stone ate the third loaf with the considered attention of someone who is tasting carefully and forming an opinion. It's good, he said. Abigail stared at him. You're not just saying that. When do I just say things? She thought about it. Never, she admitted. Then it's good. Abigail allowed herself a moment of satisfaction that was not quite a smile but was everything a smile is. Then she began cleaning up her station because Jasmine had taught her that baking included the cleaning and that the cleaning was not an afterthought. Jasmine watched them, the man and the girl, and felt the thing that was bigger than happiness. The specific thing that had no clean word, that was not one thing but the sum of many things. A table flower on the board, a door that opened onto autumn, a child who was being given something she would carry all her life. She wrote to her mother's sister in Cincinnati in September. Her Aunt Martha, her mother's younger sister, a sensible woman with a kind face and several grown children of her own, had been her nearest family for the past 3 years, and they had corresponded regularly. And when Jasmine had written about Harlan's Creek and about Stone and about the cooperative and about what had happened, her aunt had written back with the combination of relief and curiosity that family brings to the unexpected good news of someone they had been worrying about. The September letter was the first one she wrote as Mrs. Stone. She noticed this not with any particular drama, but with the attentiveness she brought to details, the way details aggregate into meaning. She told her aunt about the cooperative's first-year revenues, which were solid. She told her about Abigail, who was going to be remarkable at something she didn't know what yet, but remarkable was certain. She told her about Mrs. Aldicott, who had reached some kind of accommodation with Grayson that Jasmine did not entirely understand, but that seemed to involve regular correspondence and occasional packages of good coffee. She told her about the school, which had both teachers through the fall and was for the first time in 2 years not in danger of closing. She told her at the end of the letter about the lantern she intended to hang at the first winter snowfall. She told her she had an idea about it, about making it a thing that the town knew to expect, a light that people came toward year after year. It is a small thing, she wrote, but I have learned that small things done consistently become the shape of a life. Mother knew this. She baked every Saturday for 30 years, and what that Saturday baking built over 30 years was a record of all the days between. I am trying to build the same kind of record here. One Saturday at a time. One loaf, one lamp, one letter. I am well. I am, in the specific sense, happy. I think you will like this place if you ever come to visit. The light here is extraordinary. She sealed the letter and addressed it and put it with the outgoing mail. Then she went to the kitchen to start the bread. The October morning when Stone told her about the blizzard, the real one, the one that had taken Margaret and the boy, was a morning of such ordinary circumstances that she remembered it afterward as evidence for something, that the important conversations happen not in the prepared moments, but in the ones you don't arrange. They were in the barn. She was learning slowly and with Abigail's patient instruction the proper care of Threshold, who had accepted her by this point as a familiar and trusted presence, in the way of horses who have good natures and are treated well. Abigail had gone in for breakfast. Stone was beside her checking the gelding's near foreleg for a small cut that needed watching. He started talking while looking at the leg. He described the January of 4 years ago, the way the storm had come in, faster than he'd expected, faster than anyone had. The barometer had given a 3-hour warning, and the storm came in two. He had been in the far south pasture coming back, and Margaret had gone to the barn. The boy was 7 months old, and she had taken him because he cried when put down, and she had been managing his crying the way new mothers manage everything, by accommodation. She had gone to check the foaling mare. She had taken the lantern. The wind had come up fast, and she had gotten turned around in the dark, in the snow, and by the time she was close to the barn, she had already been in the cold too long, and the snow was past waist deep. He told all of this to the gelding's leg in a steady voice without pausing. He told it the way a person tells something they have told themselves many times, not because it gets easier, but because it becomes known, becomes a shape that can be carried. Jasmine did not interrupt. When he finished, there was a silence that was not emptiness, but weight. She loved the horses, he said finally. Yes, Jasmine said. She would have been very good with Abigail, he said. They would have been... He stopped. She had a stubbornness that Abigail has, a particular kind, a shishim. The kind that looks like certainty, Jasmine said. He looked at her. Where they know something is right and they proceed from there without checking themselves too much, she said. That kind. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. It's not a bad thing to have, she said. No, he said, it's not. He straightened up from the gelding's leg and looked at the cut and seemed satisfied. He put the salve back in the kit and snapped it closed. I think about whether she would... He stopped again. This stop was different, the kind that comes from looking for precise language, the careful kind. Whether she would think what I've done since was right. Jasmine thought about this. She knew what she believed, but she was not certain it was her place to say it, and she sat with the uncertainty for a moment. I think, she said slowly, that she would know the difference between a man who stopped living and a man who was waiting until he could again. He looked at her. I think she would have known which you were. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I should have come to the station. She understood he meant the December station, the train, the blizzard, her arrival. The original failure of the arrangement. You weren't ready, she said. No, you're ready now. He looked at her with the full, unguarded look. Yes, he said, I am. She picked up the salve kit and put it back on the shelf where it belonged. Then we don't need to spend more time on December, she said. We have October and November and December coming and all the years after. All the years after, he said. Yes, she said, those. She went to check Threshold, who accepted this attention with calm pleasure. And behind her, she heard Stone begin to hum, not a song she recognized, just a melody, something quiet and unremarkable. The kind of humming a person does when the inside of them is more settled than they have been in a while, and the sound of it comes out without planning. She took her time with Threshold. She let him hum. In the months that followed, the town did not become easy. It did not achieve anything that could be called prosperity in the broad sense. The economics were still against it in ways that could be addressed over time but not dismissed. The winters were still winters, and the altitude was still the altitude, and the isolation was still the isolation. But the cooperative ran its freight into the fall, and the fall rates were better than the spring rates because they had learned from the spring run and negotiated harder, and had Henderson and Casper arguing together at the negotiating table, which turned out to be something of an advantage. The freight company's representative, a man from Denver, who had come down expecting to deal with the individual ranchers, found himself facing 11 families with a common interest, and a woman from Cincinnati who could read a contract and did, and the rates that September were the best they had seen in 4 years. Roy Morrison's stores survived the year. Beaumont stayed through the fall and began tentatively to talk about staying through the following year, which Jasmine took as an encouraging sign. Mrs. Reyes had her chimney properly repaired by Martin Casper's older brother Frank, who turned out to be a better carpenter than anyone had known, and who then repaired 3 other chimneys on the south end of the street on a sliding scale of payment that involved mostly labor exchange and some preserved food, in one case of peaches from the Delacroix orchard. Ann Casper, the storm baby, grew with the enthusiastic single-mindedness of very young children. Thomas Casper, who had watched her arrival with wondering eyes, was as close to a devoted older brother as any child of 10 could be, and carried her on his hip with the comfortable competence of someone who regards this as simply one of his responsibilities. Hey. In September, Jasmine rode north to see Pete Henderson. She went on her own on a horse from the Coldwater stable. Stone's Bay Gelding, the cavalry horse, who she had been riding since late spring, with an ease that pleased Stone and seemed to please the horse equally. It was a clear September morning with the quality of light that comes in fall in the mountains, the particular gold of it, at this altitude, the aspen already turning on the higher slopes. She had something specific to discuss with Henderson. The cooperative's first year was nearly complete, and she had been working with the quiet persistence that characterized everything she undertook on a second proposal. A small lending arrangement between the cooperative's member ranches that would allow families to borrow against future freight revenue for specific capital improvements. It was modest in scope she was careful about. Scope having seen what happened when scope outran capacity, but it addressed one of the things she had identified in December as a root problem, the absence of capital for investment. Henderson was in his yard when she rode up, working on a section of fence that was, she noted, the correct fence. The surveyed, officially right, legally confirmed fence. "Miss Monroe," he said, then caught himself, "Mrs. Stone." "Either is fine," she said. She had found to her mild surprise that she answered to both equally, which seemed to her the right outcome of a choice she had made deliberately. She told him about the lending arrangement. He listened the way Stone listened, with his whole attention, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning the fence post in his hands. "How'd you think of this?" he said. "I've been thinking about it since December," she said. "I just didn't have the right structure until I understood how the cooperative worked." "Since December," he said. "You'd been in town 2 weeks." "3, she said. He looked at her. Then something happened on his face, not a smile exactly, but its near neighbor. "You know what Reuben says about you." "I don't." "He says you're the reason the town is still here." She was quiet for a moment. "Reuben kept 4 children alive for 15 hours in a snowstorm," she said. "That's not nothing." "No," Henderson said. "But he says without you, most of us would have sold to Grayson and scattered, and there wouldn't have been 4 children in the same place long enough to be trapped." She looked at the fence, the right fence, the confirmed fence, and then at the mountain beyond, and then at Henderson. "It takes people to build a place," she said. "I just kept pointing at the people." Henderson nodded. He was not a man who made speeches, and she liked that about him. He said, "I'll think about the lending arrangement." "That's all I'm asking," she said. She rode home. Shh. On the 1st of October, a letter came from Grayson. It was brief and professional, and it said that he had been in conversation with a timber interest about the western slopes and would like to discuss the possibility of a managed arrangement that would provide revenue to the town while preserving the watershed. He asked if there was someone appropriate to contact about forming a discussion group. Jasmine read it twice. Then she put it on the kitchen table for Stone to read when he came in. He read it, set it down, and looked at her. "Is this," he considered, "is this what good looks like?" "I think it might be what interest looks like," she said. "Which isn't the same thing, but it's a start." "Do you trust him?" "No," she said. "But I think he's operating from his own kind of honesty, and I think the school conversation mattered to him more than he intended. And I think," she paused, "I think there are people in the world who want money and what money represents, and who are also something beyond that if you give them a structure that allows them to be." He looked at her. "My mother used to say," she said, "that almost everyone has more good in them than they know what to do with." She said the problem was usually that nobody gave them a structure for it. Stone looked at the letter. Then he said, "I'll write back." "We'll write back," she said. 1 year after Jasmine Monroe had stepped off a train in a blizzard into a town she had not planned to enter in circumstances she had not planned for, Harlan's Creek held a winter gathering. It was not a formal event. No one had organized it in the usual sense. There had been no meeting, no committee, no formal invitation. What had happened was that Jasmine had, in late November, hung a lantern outside the door of the house at Coldwater Ranch. She had done this in the early evening before full dark, and the lantern was a good one with clear glass and a steady flame, and in the dark it made a light that could be seen from the main road below. She had simply done it and left the door slightly open and gone back to the kitchen, where she was making a quantity of bread and the particular ginger cake that Mrs. Aldicott had requested she make for every occasion, and which had become, over the past year, the most requested thing she baked. People came. They came from town and from the ranches on the North Road, and from the east side of the creek, and from the 3 houses on the far ridge that she had worried most about through the summer, the ones that had been closest to selling. They came in wagons and on horseback and on foot, the ones who were close enough. They came with food because people who live in places like Harlan's Creek, when they come to someone's house, do not come empty-handed, and they brought what they had and set it out on the long table in the main room and the kitchen table and any surface that would hold a dish. Abigail managed the door with the combination of hospitality and fierce organizational energy that was distinctly her own, taking coats and directing people and announcing new arrivals with a proprietary pleasure, as though the gathering were a production she had been rehearsing for months. She had named the horse, and the horse was hers now, fully and formally a present from stone that had been given with the quiet directness of a man who gives gifts as statements rather than performances. Abigail had cried briefly and furiously, and then composed herself and been too busy being delighted to cry anymore. The ginger cake was already gone by the time Jasmine came through from the kitchen. She stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the people there at Thomas Casper, who had grown 3 inches in the past year, and was in what she thought might be a serious conversation with Reuben Henderson about cattle genetics, which was a topic Thomas had developed a strong opinion about. At Clara Winslow, whose south wall had been properly insulated in October, and who was holding her youngest in one arm and talking to Martha Casper about the spring cattle drive. At Roy Morrison, who was describing the Q3 freight numbers to Pete Duvall with the particular animation of a man who has found his way through a problem and wants to share the route. At Mrs. Reyes, who was sitting with Mrs. Aldecott in the two best chairs, talking in the low, unhurried tones of women who have known each other for 30 years and have arrived at the point where they can say more with less. Mr. Beaumont and his wife Helen were there. Helen had the look this year of someone who has rested not physically, but the other kind of rested, the look of someone whose life has become bearable again in the specific way that matters most. The Delacroix family, who had nearly left in December of last year, had brought their 3 children and a quantity of wine from their root cellar, and an expression of people who have decided to belong to a place and have since been busy doing exactly that. Frank Casper, the carpenter, was engaged in what appeared to be a discussion with Henderson about a building project, the two of them gesturing at dimensions with the absorbed exactness of men who have found a shared problem. Grayson was not there. She had not expected him to be. But she had received a letter from him 2 weeks prior, brief, correct, with a postscript that was almost personal. The timber conversation is progressing. I understand your point about structures. V.G. Stone was at the far end of the room. He was in conversation with 2 of the ranchers from the North Association, and she could see from his posture the slight ease in the shoulders, the way he stood without his habitual readiness to move, that he was comfortable. That he was, in fact, simply present in a room full of people who he had known for years and who were now also part of something he had not built alone. He caught her looking. She held his gaze for a moment. In his face was something she had learned over the past year to read the way she read a kitchen or a weather sky or the mood of a horse, not translated into simple terms, but understood in its own language. What she read was gratitude, possibility, the specific look of a man who knows that what he is feeling is too large for any single word and has stopped trying to find one. She looked back at the room. The first snow of winter had come that morning, a gentle snow, the early kind, the kind that coats the world without asserting itself, that makes everything look briefly and impossibly clean. It was still falling lightly outside the windows, and the light in the room came from the stove, and the lamps, and the particular warmth of many people in the same space doing the ordinary things. Eating, talking, listening, moving past each other in the easy negotiation of bodies that know each other well. Children ran through the room with the specific velocity of children who have been given permission to run, which they will exercise until the adults remember they didn't actually give permission. And she watched them, Thomas Casper and Reuben Henderson's youngest, and the Duvall children and Abigail, who was running with them, and also very clearly supervising, because Abigail's supervision was a constant, regardless of what she was officially doing. Mrs. Aldecott from her chair saw Jasmine in the doorway and gave her the small, precise nod of someone who has been in a place long enough to know what it looks like when things are right. Jasmine went to the door. She opened it and stood for a moment in the cold dark, looking out at the lantern. She had hung the steady flame in the clear glass, making its small, unambiguous light in the mountain night. The snow was falling softly on the road below, and the trees on the ridge above, and the barn beyond where Threshold was warm in her stall. And the cold was the good kind of cold, the kind that the body meets with the warm things it is made of. She thought about December, about stepping off a train into weather, into a failure of an arrangement, into a town that was half empty, and a man who had not come to meet her, and a child who had a name for a horse, and an empty house full of good pots and no cloth on the table. She thought about the walk she had taken through the snow, counting empty buildings, feeling the particular grief of a place that is ending. She thought about bread and soup and cold hands warm between her own, and a note in a firm, oversized hand that said, your friend Abigail Stone, and 11 ranches making a common cause, and a man beside the creek who said, building with the certainty of a word arriving correctly. She hung the lantern a little higher. From inside came the sound of the fiddle. Beauchamp had brought it again, because Beauchamp always brought it, and then laughter, and then the sound of people who know each other dancing. She stood at the threshold of the door in the cold and the dark and the falling snow, with the warmth behind her and the winter night ahead, and she felt the particular quality of a thing that has been built out of ordinary materials by ordinary people who chose day by day to keep building. She went back in. Stone met her at the door with her coat, which she had left on the chair inside, and he put it around her shoulders with the matter-of-fact carefulness of a man who pays attention to what is needed. And then his hand stayed for a moment at her shoulder, and she put her own hand over his. The Henderson boy is talking to Thomas Casper about breeding programs, she said. I know, I expect that conversation continues for about 20 years. Mrs. Aldecott and Mrs. Reyes are planning something. I can tell by the way they're talking. I've noticed. He was looking at the room. I think it involves the Spring School Festival. Oh, that's not good. No, he said, we should probably be worried. She laughed, not a polite laugh, the real kind, the kind that surprises you with its own fullness. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered rather late in life that this is one of the things he was missing. Outside, the snow fell on Harlan's Creek, on the lantern at the gate, and the main street below, and the mountains above, and the road between the ranch and the town, and the fiddle played inside, and children ran, and the people who had decided to stay were staying. The bride who arrived too late had not saved the town. The town had been here, and the people had been here, and the stubbornness and the history and the accumulated weight of 30 years of people knowing each other's names that had been here. She had simply looked at what was already there and asked what it needed, and then done the work of providing it, and found in the doing that the work was also the answer to a question she had been carrying since long before she boarded the train. She had needed something to build toward. She had found it. She had found it not in a man, though the man was part of it, and not in a place, though the place was part of it, and not in a purpose, though the purpose was part of it. She had found it in the combination, which was something her mother had tried to tell her, and which she had not quite understood until she lived it, that belonging is not something you find exactly, or something that finds you. It is something that is built out of daily decisions, out of bread on Thursdays, and cold hands on the road north, and 11 ranchers around a table, and a child who names a horse for the feeling of being at the beginning of something. You build it and it holds you, and then you build more. The lantern outside the door of Coldwater Ranch burned through the night, and in the morning when the snow was fresh and the world was quiet, and the mountains stood in their ancient, unchanged way above the valley, it was still burning. It had done what lanterns do. It had made a light that people could see, and they had come.